Part 2 of Became a Crow in the World of Superheroes. Perhaps it was their history as teacher and student, but Spider-Man and Connors moved in perfect sync. They left Rotha far behind, reaching the laboratory in a matter of minutes. The glass shattered as two silhouettes tumbled through the window. If their sizes were compared to coffee orders, Rotha was a venti, Connors was a grande, and Spider-Man was a small. Even next to the medium-sized Connors, Peter looked remarkably compact. Connors didn't waste a second. He headed straight for the inner lab, his voice a low, raspy growl. Rotha Irfan. What? The name of the other lizard. Spider-Man kept pace with him. Who is he? A colleague. A specialist in biology. Connors reached the workstation where they usually mixed their compounds. His clawed hands moved with surprising precision among the delicate glass vials. Peter still wasn't quite sure who Rotha was. He's the corporate suit from the vision I shared with you. Oz's voice rang in his ear, timed perfectly as always. Thank God. I thought you'd gone back to the docks for more fries. Having Oz back was a relief. After his leap of faith from Gwen's roof, the bird had pulled his usual disappearing act. Spider sense didn't help when it came to Oz. It was like knowing someone was walking behind you, only to turn around and find the street empty. Oz let out a mental yawn. I thought about it, but I wanted to see how the lizard-on-lizard action turned out. Curiosity killed the crow, and all that. So why did he turn into that? Peter asked, directing the question to both the bird and the doctor. Drank too much of the corporate Kool-Aid, probably, Oz muttered. Connors provided the more scientific answer. The human trials at the Veterans Hospital went south this morning. The lizard serum is highly addictive. Once he was exposed, his personality began to warp. He became violent, obsessed. Now, he's driven by a constant hunger for more of the serum. Peter found Connors' explanation much more convincing. Also, he had no idea what Kool-Aid was. But what about you, Doctor? Peter asked after a moment. Connors paused, looking up at the masked teenager. Even now, he seemed to find Peter's new identity hard to process. The riot at the hospital proved that the serum is fundamentally flawed. I couldn't sit back and watch. But why change yourself? Because he's a madman. I have to stop him. Connors turned back to the equipment, adjusting the formula for a more potent antidote. The serum is a plague. I won't let it spread any further. To keep Peter from asking more questions, Connors explained how he had figured everything out. We argued this morning. He took the serum to the hospital, and I stayed here. I was willing to be fired rather than start trials I knew were dangerous. When I came back to the lab to gather my things, I noticed someone had used the computer. Connors was lying, of course. He hadn't returned to the lab just to look at it one last time. He was a man whose life's dream was to regrow his arm. Being fired was a crushing blow, especially knowing Oscorp would keep his formula. He had intended to be the first human subject. But when he'd returned, he'd found the lab disturbed. Out of professional curiosity, he had checked the security logs and the browser history. He found a search for the Brooklyn Veterans Hospital riot. I saw that you'd been checking the news, Connors said. And I noticed how familiar you were with the equipment. Oz perked up at this. Wait, did you really not use incognito mode? Rookie mistake, kid. Not now, Oz. Peter hissed, his voice tight with stress. Oz ignored him. Listen, before the truck hit me, I was crossing the street and decided to check a few specific questions. I realized I'd left a tab open that would have been very embarrassing for my next of kin. I spent my last 3 seconds of life frantically clearing my cache. I died with my dignity intact, and I expect you to do the same. Peter felt a headache forming. Oz was entirely too comfortable sharing his past life, especially when they were in the middle of a crisis. He forced himself to focus on Connors. You seemed to know exactly what was coming, Connors continued. You moved straight to synthesizing an antidote. It was impressive, Peter. Truly. The doctor's gaze was steady, his admiration genuine despite his monstrous appearance. Between the formula you gave me, the questions you asked, and the way you handled yourself, it wasn't hard to guess who was under the mask. Doctor, it's okay, Peter. We all have secrets. I have no intention of sharing yours. Connor's nose twitched. A long, slender tongue flicked out from between his teeth. He's almost here. Peter felt it too, the buzzing at the base of his skull. How much longer for the antidote? 1 minute. I can't leave the station until the reaction is complete. I need you to hold him off. Can you do that? Or should I go out there while you finish the mix? It is your formula, after all. No, doctor. Peter turned toward the shattered window. I'll stop him. You finish the cure. Compared to every other lizard creature Peter had faced that day, Drive. Rotha was in a different league. He was larger, stronger, and fast enough to make Peter's enhanced reflexes feel sluggish. Up until this moment, they hadn't actually fought. Peter had spent his time running, dodging, and helping Connors. Now, with the doctor locked into a 60-second synthesis of the antidote, Peter was the only thing standing between a cold-blooded killer and the cure. The air hissed as Peter fired his web shooters like a pair of semi-automatics. He stood perched on a glass partition, raining down webbing in an attempt to anchor the massive green beast charging across the lab. God, how is he doing that? Every strand Peter fired was batted away or shredded. Rotha's tail, thick and powerful as a constrictor snake, moved with a mind of its own. It whipped through the air, intercepting every web line before it could find purchase. Doctor, are you sure he's a lizard? He fights like he's got 5 arms. Peter shouted over his shoulder. Just keep him back, Peter. Stop the commentary and focus. Right. Focusing. Peter turned his head back to the fight just as his spider sense went off like a fire alarm in a library. It was a physical jolt, a scream at the base of his brain. Suddenly, the world slowed down. It was as if time had been stretched thin, turning the chaos into a frame-by-frame slideshow. He saw Rotha midair, his massive body twisting with predatory grace. He saw the tail beginning its arc, the scales shimmering under the lab lights. Peter watched it happen, his mind processing the movement but his body failing to react in time. Crack. The bullet time shattered. Reality slammed back into place with the force of a freight train. The tail hit Peter square in the chest, launching him across the room. Not again. Peter spun through the air, desperately firing webs at every surface he could see. He managed to create a makeshift net in the corner of the lab, catching his momentum just before he could plow into Connor's workstation. What exactly was that? Oz's voice whispered in his ear. I'm working on it, Peter groaned, shaking his head to stop the ringing. He was slumped against the wall, his chest burning. Oz was suddenly there, standing on the floor in front of him. The bird began to mimic the swinging motion of Rotha's tail, though his small size made the gesture look ridiculous. You just stood there, kid. You saw it coming, you watched it happen, and you let him hit you. It's like you're waiting for an invitation to dodge. Oz was right. Peter was still learning to trust the buzzing in his head. In those slowed down moments, he was too busy analyzing the threat to actually move out of the way. It was like a video game where the prompt appears on screen, and you're too busy looking at the button to actually press it. The hit had taken a chunk out of his health, but Spider-Men were notoriously hard to kill. Kurt, what do you think you're achieving? Rotha ignored Peter entirely, his heavy footsteps thudding toward the synthesis station. Peter felt a surge of irritation at being dismissed. He lunged forward, trying to grab Rotha's arm. Rotha didn't even look at him. He simply reached out a clawed hand, caught Peter by the face, and held him back. Peter kicked and punched, but the reach of the larger creature was too great. I told you, you're an inferior product. A fluke of nature. Rotha's grip was like an iron vice. He felt like he was trying to crush a walnut that wouldn't break. Better a fluke than a monster, Peter grunted. Rotha roared, his patience thinning. He wound up like a professional pitcher and hurled Peter across the lab. Peter fired a web mid-flight, pivoting off a ceiling beam to land a few feet away from Connors. Spider-Man. Connors barked, his eyes never leaving the vials. I know, I'm on it. Peter scrambled to his feet, bouncing on the balls of his feet like a prize fighter. I'm doing terrible at this. You have 30 seconds left. Connors yelled. The doctor wanted to step in, but if he let go of the mixture now, the reaction would fail. The seconds they'd save in a fight would cost them minutes in the lab. It was a gamble they couldn't afford. I think you're looking at this the wrong way, Oz's voice cut through the noise. Is that so? Peter muttered. You got any better ideas? I'm the one taking the hits here. If you want me to step in, I can. But then all this effort you've put in becomes someone else's victory, Oz said. I didn't mean that. Just, tell me. Peter knew Oz wasn't just a bird that stole fries. He'd seen the teleporting, the mental links, the strange knowledge of things to come. If Oz wanted to, he could probably turn Rotha into a leather belt in 5 seconds. But Peter didn't want that. He'd provided the formula that caused this mess. He'd been the spark. If he couldn't fix it himself, if he had to rely on a supernatural crow to bail him out every time things got hard, then what was the point? What was the responsibility Ben had talked about? Responsibility, Parker. Yours. You're fighting him like he's another one of those veterans, Oz said, his voice unusually calm. He isn't. He's faster, he's smarter, and he thinks he's evolved. So stop being a guy who crawls on walls. Be a spider. Remember, your strength is more than just muscle. It's the way you move. Peter listened. The words sank in, shifting something in his mind. He took a slow breath, letting his heart rate level out. I've got it. Got what? You've got 20 seconds. Move, Connors shouted. Peter didn't say another word. He fired a web and vanished from his spot, moving toward Rotha like a blur of red and blue. I already told you. Rotha saw the boy coming and prepared for another throw. He reached out with his massive hand, but his tail was already coiled, ready for the killing blow. He expected the boy to dodge the hand, and he did. But he wasn't prepared for what happened next. Instead of jumping away, Peter leaned into the momentum. He caught the tail mid-swing, wrapping his arms and legs around the scaly limb. He stuck to it, his skin clinging to the scales like industrial adhesive. The force of the tail swing tried to throw him off, but Peter used that energy. He whipped around the tail, trailing webbing as he went. He bound the limb to itself, then to Rotha's own leg. Before Rotha could react, Peter was everywhere. He was a shadow on the ceiling, a blur on the floor. He used every anchor point in the room, the beams, the desks, the heavy machinery. Rotha felt the sudden, crushing weight of the webbing. It wasn't just a few strands, it was a cocoon being spun in seconds. He was being bound by his own movements. Rotha tried to snarl, but a glob of webbing sealed his jaw. Peter scrambled over the monster's head, anchoring a line to his shoulders and another to the floor. Peter pulled with everything he had. Down. Rotha's legs buckled under the sheer leverage. The giant lizard slammed into the floor, his limbs pinned to his sides, his head forced down by the tension of a dozen high tensile lines. Peter stood on top of the pinned beast, his chest heaving. He looked toward the workstation. Doctor, I hope you're keeping track of the time. It happened exactly as Peter had hoped. The moment he finished his shout, Connors lunged forward with the completed serum. He moved with a predatory grace, thrusting the needle through the layers of webbing and driving it deep into Rotha's scaled hide. Rotha let out a scream that tore through the laboratory. It was a sound straight out of a nightmare. The remaining glass in the windows, already weakened by the earlier struggle, shattered completely under the frequency of the roar. Shards rained down toward the street hundreds of feet below. Then, the giant went still. Rotha's head slumped, his body going limp as he lost consciousness. Dr. Connors. Peter saw the doctor stumble and immediately leapt down from Rotha's back to catch him. He held the lizard man steady as Connors began to shake. Are you okay? It's starting, Connors wheezed. Peter watched in grim fascination as Connors' thick green skin began to crack and pop. It looked like a snake shedding its entire life in a matter of seconds. Pieces of calcified scales flaked off, fluttering to the floor like autumn leaves. The massive, hulking frame began to shrink, folding back into the shape of a man. A few moments later, Peter was left holding a very human, very naked drive. Connors. Peter acted fast. He fired a web line at a lab coat draped over a nearby chair and yanked it over, draping it across the doctor's shoulders. Clothes, doctor. You should cover up. Connors didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on the empty space where his right arm had been only minutes before. The limb was gone again, leaving only the familiar, scarred stump. Peter saw the look in his eyes and felt a pang of sympathy. A temporary setback is just the prelude to a new success, he said softly. Connors looked up at him and managed a weak, weary smile. You're a good kid, Peter. I'm not as fragile as I look. Peter rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a bit awkward. Sorry, I was worried. But why did the cure hit you too, doctor? It was supposed to be for him. I designed this batch to be aerosolized, Connors explained, his voice returning to its normal, academic tone. It's absorbed through the skin much faster than a standard injection. When the seal broke, I was exposed to the vapor. Since I had the serum in my system, it triggered the reversion. That makes sense. I wondered why the air smelled so strange. Peter nodded, then looked over at the bundle of webbing where Rotha was still pinned. But what about him? Why hasn't he changed back yet? Connors frowned. He looked at the massive, unmoving form of the other lizard. He should have. The rate of decay in his cells is much higher than mine. Maybe he just took too much of the stuff, Peter suggested. Connors shook his head. No, that's not how the biology works. Once the antidote is introduced, it spreads like a fire through a forest. The size of the forest doesn't stop the fire from burning, it just takes a little longer. But he isn't burning at all. Peter didn't like the sound of that. He turned his head slightly toward the crow on his shoulder. What do you think, Oz? Any expert insights? You want my professional opinion? Oz asked. Yeah, I have no idea. Peter felt a sudden, violent urge to pluck every feather off the bird's body. However, Oz continued, my advice is to get the very human, very vulnerable drive. Connors out of here. Usually, in horror movies, this is the part where the survivor says, wow, I'm so glad we made it, right before the killer snaps their neck from behind. Peter felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen enough movies to know Oz was right. He turned back to the doctor. Doctor, we need to go. Now. No, I have to stay. I need to monitor his vitals. The data from a forced reversion is. The data can wait, Peter interrupted. He didn't wait for an argument. He scooped Connors up, throwing the man over his shoulder. Peter, what are you doing? Think of the science. We need to record the results. Science rule number 1, Peter said, heading for the window. Safety first. You can't just kidnap me. Why aren't we taking the elevator? Elevators are death traps in movies, doctor. Trust me on this. You watch too many films, Peter. Peter reached the edge of the shattered window and paused. He looked back at the mummy of webbing where Rotha was supposed to be sleeping. What is it? Connors asked. Something's wrong, Peter whispered. If something's wrong, then run, you idiot. Oz screamed in his ear. Don't just stand there and be a cliché. A split second later, Peter's spider sense didn't just tingle, it exploded. The webbing around Rotha's body didn't just tear, it disintegrated. A green blur, fast as a lightning strike, whipped through the air toward them. Peter could see it clearly, Rotha's tail, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible after a dose of the antidote. It wasn't aiming for Peter. It was aiming for Connors. Peter didn't have time to think. He hurled Connors out the window into the open air, then twisted his body to take the full force of the blow. The tail slammed into his ribs with a sickening crack, throwing him out of the lab and into the night sky. Spider-Man. Connor's scream was lost in the wind as he plummeted toward the street. Peter ignored the burning pain in his side. He fired 2 web lines, anchoring himself to the building's frame to arrest his fall, then immediately dove after the doctor. Doctor. Reach for the line. Peter fired a wide, net-like web toward the falling man. Connors looked like he wanted to scream at the absurdity of the situation, but his survival instinct won out. He reached out and grabbed the webbing with his one good hand. Peter engaged the retraction on his shooters, pulling himself toward Connors until he could wrap an arm around the man's waist. I've got you. He looked down. The ground was coming up fast. He could try to swing, but the centrifugal force of a high-speed turn would likely snap Connor's neck. The doctor was too fragile for heroics right now. Peter fired a dozen lines at the face of the building, not to stop them, but to create drag. He used his own body as a shield, bracing for the impact. They hit the pavement with a heavy thud. Peter landed on his feet, but the shock of the drop went straight through his boots. He hissed, hopping in place as his feet throbbed. Ow, ow, ow. That hurt. The police units surrounding the building were on them in seconds. They stared at the masked vigilante and the half-naked man in a lab coat, their guns raised but hesitant. They didn't have time to ask questions. A massive shadow eclipsed the streetlights above them. Rotha hit the ground like a meteor, the asphalt cracking under his weight. He stood up, his yellow eyes glowing with a feral, hateful light. He looked at the two of them and hissed, his voice a distorted, reptilian rasp. You both forgot one thing. I'm still a scientist. He dropped to all fours and charged. Connors scrambled backward, his voice cracking as he shouted into Peter's ear. Run, Peter. He's coming. Move. Peter felt a strange sense of déjà vu, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He grabbed Connors and started a dead sprint toward the police line. As they neared the cruisers, Connors began waving his one arm frantically. Open fire. Shoot it. Shoot the monster. Captain Stacy stood by the lead car, his eyes widening as he recognized the man in the lab coat. Connors had written Gwen's university recommendation. He wasn't about to let the man be eaten. All units. Stacy roared. Target the creature behind the vigilante. Fire. The night air was suddenly filled with the thunder of gunfire. The muzzle flashes lit up the street, signaling that the riot was far from over. The thunder of gunfire was deafening. Peter's enhanced senses made the noise even more punishing, but he kept running, shielding drive. Connors as best he could. Peter's body was built to handle this kind of chaos, but Connors was back to being a middle-aged man with a missing arm. Captain George Stacy watched the scene from behind a police cruiser, his brow furrowed. From his perspective, the sight was surreal. Spider-Man was sprinting toward the police line with Connors bouncing awkwardly on his back. Because the doctor only had one full arm, his attempt to cover his ears looked erratic and frantic. It was a hellish, almost comical image in the middle of a war zone. With the police providing cover fire, Peter finally crossed the perimeter. The officers were veterans, they kept their sights firmly on the massive reptilian shadow and away from the two people fleeing it. That was close, Peter panted, sliding to a stop and setting Connors down. The roar of the police rifles was still ringing in his head, but he was relieved they hadn't been treated as targets. Connors landed on his feet and immediately leaned a hand on Peter's shoulder. He looked pale, and the ride had clearly done a number on his equilibrium. Peter, Spider-Man, I need to tell you something. Before you make a catastrophic mistake. Peter straightened up, his lenses widening in concern. What is it, Doc? Connors let go of Peter's shoulder and reached around to rub his lower back, his spine letting out a series of sharp, audible pops. Do you have any idea what happens when an object in motion comes to a sudden, violent stop? A sudden stop. I mean, in physics terms, sure, but did you think about what would happen if I'd missed the webbing? Or if the tension had snapped? You weren't rescuing me, Peter. You were seconds away from committing involuntary manslaughter. Peter went silent. The weight of the words hit him harder than Rotha's tale had. He hadn't considered the physics of it. Since the bite, he'd mostly been swinging through the city alone or webbing up thugs. Rescuing a fragile human from a free fall was a different level of responsibility, and he'd played it entirely too fast and loose. It looks like someone needs to brush up on their Newtonian mechanics before they try to save the day again. Oz's voice drifted into his mind, sharp and mocking. Poor Gwen. Her fate was almost stolen by the lizard. Peter clenched his jaw, trying to shut out the bird's voice. Oz, not now. Shutting up. Fine. But don't blame me when you eventually hit a wall you can't walk through. Peter turned back to Connors, his posture slumped like a student who'd been caught failing a test. I'm sorry, Doctor. I was just so worried about you. I didn't think. It's all right, kid, Connors said, his voice softening as he saw the genuine regret on Peter's face. I know your heart was in the right place. Just remember for next time, being a hero requires more than just strength. It requires precision. If you ever find yourself in that position again, just give me the serum and let me take my chances. Connors patted Peter's shoulder. He knew this boy was fundamentally good. I've never been a Spider-Man, so I can't give you tactical advice. But you're brilliant, Peter. You'll figure it out. I will, Peter promised. Movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Captain Stacy was approaching them, looking like a man who had more questions than the city had answers. Peter felt a surge of nerves. Not long ago, he'd been sitting at this man's dinner table, and now they were meeting as allies in a tactical mess. "Professor Connors," Stacy said as he reached them. George had a great deal of respect for the man. Connors had written the recommendation that got Gwen into her top choice for university. But respect didn't erase the confusion. Why was Connors here? Why was he wearing nothing but a tattered lab coat? And why did it look like he and the vigilante were on a first-name basis? "Are you all right? Any injuries?" Stacy asked, his eyes scanning the doctor for wounds. "I'm fine, Captain. Spider-Man arrived just in time," Connors said, throwing the credit toward Peter. "I see." Stacy looked at Peter, who gave a small, awkward wave. "And the other one, is he still in the building?" Peter shot a worried look at Connors. He was certain no one else knew the doctor had been the second lizard. If that secret got out, Connors would lose everything. But Connors didn't hesitate. He spoke with a blunt honesty that stunned Peter. "Actually, Captain, I was the other creature. The smaller one." Stacy's eyebrows shot up. "And that one," Connors pointed toward the center of the street where the police were still raining lead into Rotha's shadow, "is Dr. Rotha Irfan, a colleague of mine. He was exposed to the serum during a botched trial at the Veterans Hospital this morning. The compound is highly addictive and causes extreme psychological instability." Stacy scowled, his mind racing to connect the dots. So the hospital riot was his doing. Connors nodded, pulling his lab coat tighter against the night chill. "I saw your press conference this morning, Captain. It was well handled. But you were wrong about one thing." He looked at Peter. "Spider-Man was there to help. He isn't the cause of this. He's the solution." "Doctor," Peter whispered, moved by the defense. Oz, perched on Peter's head, let out a bored sigh. He wasn't surprised. Most of Spider-Man's villains weren't pure evil, they were mentors, friends, or colleagues who had lost their way. Peter Parker was like a magnet for complicated people. Except for the Green Goblin. That guy was just a jerk. Oz looked toward Rotha. The police had emptied their magazines, and the massive lizard was curled into a ball in the middle of the street, unmoving. He looked like a snake in hibernation. "Do you know what a predator does when it's cornered and dying?" Oz asked. "What?" Peter thought. "It stops being a predator and starts being a bomb." Peter's spider sense flared. He saw a group of officers cautiously approaching the curled-up monster, their guns lowered. "No, get back," Peter shouted. Stacy turned, annoyed at being interrupted. "Listen, kid, just because you saved a professor doesn't mean." "Captain, tell them to move." Peter didn't wait for a response. He launched himself toward the center of the street. "Everyone, get back. Now." He fired several lines of webbing, not at Rotha, but at the officers. He yanked them backward just as they were closing in. They tumbled onto the asphalt, shouting in confusion and anger. Then, Rotha exploded into motion. His vitality hadn't faded, it had just been coiled like a spring. He lashed out with a massive clawed hand toward the nearest officer, who had frozen in terror. No, Peter didn't have time to be graceful. He slammed into the officer, throwing him out of the way and taking the blow intended for the man's head. Rotha's tail whipped around, hitting Peter with the force of a wrecking ball. The sound of the impact echoed through the street, a wet, heavy crack as Peter was launched through the air. He slammed into a parked car, the metal door crumpling inward under the force of his body. "Spider-Man!" Connors yelled. The officers who had been pulled back watched in horror. They realized in that instant that the vigilante had just taken a hit that would have pulverized any one of them. Suddenly, a bright searchlight cut through the darkness from above. A news helicopter had breached the perimeter, its camera tracking the wreckage. "Who let that bird in here? Where are my air units?" Stacy roared into his radio. "Sorry, sir, they came in from the south side, we couldn't." "I don't want excuses. Everyone, open fire." The street erupted into noise again. Rotha was kneeling on the pavement, his hands over his head as the bullets peppered his hide. He looked smaller now. The serum was finally starting to burn out of his system. "Get up, Peter," Oz whispered, his voice soft against the side of Peter's mask. Peter tried to move, but every inch of his body was screaming. Every bone felt like it had been turned into glass and then shattered. "I've got good news and bad news," Oz said. "Which one?" "Good news," Peter groaned. He just wanted to close his eyes and let the sirens lull him to sleep. "Good news is that Rotha is finally reverting. He's almost human again." "Finally," Peter whispered. "And the bad news?" "The bad news is that the tail strike broke 14 of your bones. This is the worst you've been hit since you started the suit. Do you want me to take over for a bit?" Peter went silent. He thought about it. The pain was a heavy, suffocating thing. Then he started to laugh, a small, pained sound. "I think that's good news too," Peter said. "Oh," Oz sounded surprised. "It means I've still got 192 bones that are working just fine." Peter began to push himself out of the dented car. Every movement was a struggle, a jagged spike of pain shooting through his nervous system. But he kept going. He stood up, his posture hunched, his breathing heavy. He raised an arm to shield his eyes from the helicopter's searchlight. The gunfire stopped. The street went silent as the officers watched the red and blue figure stumble out of the wreckage. Then, a single officer started to clap. Another followed. Within seconds, the sound of applause was echoing off the glass towers. Captain Stacy didn't join in, but he didn't stop them either. He looked at the boy and then at Connors, who was patting his own chest in relief. Rotha was on his knees. The scales were receding, his monstrous form shrinking back into the shape of a man. He knew it was over. He had a choice, run, or finish the fight. He chose the latter. He let out one final, human scream of rage and lunged at Peter. Two figures collided in the middle of the street, illuminated by the blinding light from above. A lizard and a spider, caught in a final, desperate dance. The white cruiser glided through the city streets. The hum of the engine was low, but in the heavy silence of the cabin, it was the only thing George and Connors could hear. "So," George said, breaking the quiet before he'd even buckled his seatbelt. "You actually know him. Him, the vigilante, the Spider-Man, the person the media and half the precinct were already calling a hero." George hadn't joined in the cheering, but he couldn't deny what he'd seen. The lizard-fueled nightmare Rotha had created was over, and the boy was the reason why. New York felt like itself again, loud, dark, and dangerous, but normal. "I know him," Connors said, leaning back against the headrest. "But I'm not going to give you a name. You understand why?" George nodded. He understood the concept of the mask, even if he didn't like it. "I can let it slide for now. On one condition, as long as everything that happened today proves he had no part in starting it. If it turns out he's a necessary link in the investigation, I'll need a name. Don't make this harder for me than it already is." "I'll tell you everything I can," Connors promised. The silence returned. They were heading toward the precinct. Spider-Man had the luxury of swinging away into the night once the punching was done, but the police didn't. They had reports to file, scenes to secure, and a mountain of bureaucracy waiting for them. George leaned his head against the cool glass of the window. "He's young, isn't he?" I heard his voice. "He sounds like a kid. Is he even 18? Connors glanced at him, his eyes sharp. "Are you fishing for information, Captain?" George offered a tired smile. "Just call it a conversation between two men, Professor. No rank, no badges. Just us." Connors sighed. He knew Peter wasn't going to stop. From everything he'd seen, the boy was determined to be the hero the city expected. He had a heart that was almost dangerously good. "If I told you he was a minor, would you believe me?" "That young?" George asked, his voice dropping. "Yes. To do all this for fun?" "No, nobody does this for fun. God." George was genuinely shaken. The reality of Spider-Man's age was harder to swallow than the existence of the monsters. He hadn't imagined the weight of the city was being carried by a child. "Why does he do it?" George asked. "Honestly, I don't know," Connors admitted. "I've never asked. His parents would probably have a heart attack if they knew," George muttered. Connors let out a dry, hollow laugh. Peter's parents, Richard and Mary Parker, were long gone, lost to a plane crash years ago. If anyone had the right to lecture the boy about his recklessness, it was his aunt and uncle. But his uncle was. Peter Parker was a tragedy wrapped in a miracle. Connors wondered what drove him. Most people in this world were out for themselves, yet Peter stood in the dark like a beacon. In a city full of shadows, a light that bright was bound to draw attention. George cleared his throat. One more thing, Professor. The precinct was visible now, its blue lights reflecting off the asphalt. Will this incident affect your standing? I mean, I'm thinking about Gwen's university recommendation. You are a remarkably selfish man, George, Connors said flatly. Selfish. I'm being a father. Selfish. Hey, selfish. George scowled as he pulled into the parking lot. Filled Diamond. A few hours later, George dragged his exhausted body out of the station. He said his goodbyes to the night shift and climbed into his personal car. The work hadn't been physical, but the mental strain of the debriefings and the paperwork had left him hollow. He knew what tomorrow would look like. The news would be a circus. He'd have to stand in front of a podium and explain why he was issuing a warrant for the kid one day and potentially a commendation the next. He wasn't sure how his pride was going to handle it. He sighed, gripping the steering wheel. Spider-Man had been flawless today. From the hospital to the fight at Oscorp, he'd done the job George's own men couldn't do. He thought back to the argument at dinner. Peter had been so adamant that Spider-Man's intentions were good. At the time, George had brushed it off as the naivety of a fan. How could a kid know what was in the heart of a masked vigilante? Now, George felt like the fool. He chuckled to himself as he pulled into his driveway. He pushed the front door open, the familiar scent of home easing the tension in his shoulders. I'm back, he called out. His wife, Helen, met him in the hallway. She took his jacket, her eyes scanning his face for signs of trouble. Are you okay? We saw the live feeds. We were worried sick. George kissed her cheek. I'm fine. Somebody did a lot of heavy lifting for us tonight. Helen smiled. Maybe you should find a way to apologize to Peter for being so hard on him at dinner. Absolutely not, George said, his tone turning mock stubborn. As a cop, I was right to be suspicious. As a citizen, he was wrong to doubt the police. And I still haven't forgiven him for trying to move in on my daughter. You're impossible, Helen laughed, patting his chest before heading to the kitchen to fix him a late-night snack. George walked down the hall to check on his sons. They were fast asleep. Finally, he stopped at Gwen's door and gave it a soft knock. Hey, sweetheart, I'm home. Just a second. He heard a frantic shuffling from inside, like she was hiding something. A moment later, the door cracked open, and Gwen poked her head out. Hi, Dad. How was your night? Fine. Same as always. Everyone's safe. Gwen's eyes searched his face. So, are you going to apologize to Peter? Please. George threw his hands up. Why are you and your mother ganging up on me? I was doing my job. He made a phone gesture with his hand. Anyway, did Peter get home safe? Did he text you? He did. He's perfectly safe, Gwen said, her voice a little too bright. She winced and leaned against the doorframe. I'd love to stay and chat, but it's late. I need to get to sleep. Sure. Get some rest. George barely finished his sentence before the door slammed shut. That was weird. A second later, the door popped open again. Gwen's head reappeared. No midnight snack for me tonight. I'm on a diet. The door slammed shut again. A diet, George muttered. Gwen never turned down a late-night snack. He shrugged and headed back to the living room. Maybe that was just what happened when girls started dating. Inside Gwen's room, the silence was heavy for only a moment. Gwen turned toward the sofa. Oz's head popped up first, followed closely by Peter. A diet, they both asked at the same time. Their eyes collectively shifted to the open pizza box on the desk, where a few half-eaten slices were still visible. Gwen slammed the lid shut, her face flushing. I had to say something so he wouldn't come in and find you too. I'm not the problem, Oz said, hopping onto the desk. He can't see me anyway. It's the kid you should be worried about. You're so full of yourself, Oz. You didn't even help him tonight. Gwen planted her hands on her hips. Hey, he's the one who turned down my assistance. Oz mimicked her posture, fluffing his wings. Gwen turned her attention to Peter. He didn't look like the handsome, bright-eyed boy from school anymore. He was a mess of purple bruises and swelling. He looked pathetic, but he was sitting there with a goofy, tired smile that made him look even worse. It was my mess, Gwen, Peter said softly. I couldn't let Oz fix it for me. Typical, Oz muttered. I think she's trying to break up our partnership, kid. Let's just go home. Despite his talk of leaving, Oz had already reached the pizza box. He kicked the lid open with a claw and started picking at a slice. I saved you a piece, by the way. No need to thank me. Gwen rolled her eyes and sat down next to Peter on the sofa. She reached out, her fingers hovering tentatively over his bruised cheek. The sight of him in this state made her heart ache. Are you sure you don't need a hospital? She asked. Peter caught her hand, his thumb stroking her palm. He gave her a weak smile. I'll be fine. Oz says I'll heal up after a good night's sleep. My body works a little differently now. Gwen looked at the bird for confirmation. Oz looked up from his pizza, a crust dangling from his beak. Intimacy usually speeds up the recovery process, or so I've heard. Oz, Peter barked. The sudden movement made him wince as his bruised ribs protested. He slumped back into the cushions with a sharp intake of breath. Gwen's face went scarlet, and she shot the bird a murderous look, telling him to be quiet before he made things worse. Actually, Oz said, ignoring the death stare. He hopped onto Gwen's head. She tried to swat him away, but he clung to her hair until she gave up. He's still growing, which means his metabolic rate is through the roof. His healing factor is only going to get stronger from here. You don't have to worry. He leaned in closer to Gwen's ear. Of course, if you kissed him, the adrenaline might get those cells moving even faster. Get out of here. Gwen swiped at him, and this time her hand connected. Oz let out a sharp cackle and took flight, heading straight for the open window. I'm going to find some fries. Have fun, you two. The two of them watched him disappear into the night. When the room went quiet again, the tension shifted. It felt smaller, more private. Gwen picked up the tattered remains of Peter's mask from the floor. One of the eye lenses was cracked, and the fabric was scorched. Why a spider? She asked, turning the mask over in her hands. Because I was bitten by one, Peter said. That's it. That's the whole reason. That's it. They were sitting close now, their shoulders touching. Gwen smiled, her eyes searching his. What if I bit you? What would happen then? You already did, Peter said, his voice dropping to a whisper. A long time ago. I don't believe you. Gwen leaned in until their foreheads were touching. It's true. Gwen breathed in. He smelled like wood smoke and old copper, but she didn't care. Why do you do it, Peter? Why be the Spider-Man? Peter looked away for a second, a dozen different answers floating through his mind. None of them felt right until he settled on the simplest one. Responsibility. Responsibility. This thing gave me power. I can do things no one else can. If I don't use that to help, it feels like a waste. It feels wrong. So you just put on a mask and go out there. There has to be a reason, Peter. Something that drives you. Peter looked at her. He saw the genuine need for an answer in her eyes. He realized he wanted her to know. He wanted her to understand the weight he carried. Before Ben died, I was at a convenience store, Peter began. His voice was thick with a grief that hadn't quite faded. I'd gotten into an argument with the clerk over a few cents for a bottle of milk. I was angry, so when a guy came in and robbed the place, I just watched. I had the power to stop him, but I didn't. I let him walk right past me. He paused, the memory of the man's face flashing in his mind. The thief looked at me and threw me the bottle of milk I couldn't afford. He thought we were on the same side. I let him go because I was petty. Peter didn't finish the story. He didn't have to. Gwen was smart enough to connect the dots. Oh, Peter. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It was my fault, Peter said. I could have stopped it, and I didn't. That's why I can't look away anymore. It's why I had to stop the lizard today. I gave drive. Connors that formula. If people got hurt, it was on me. Not just for Ben, but for everyone. Gwen couldn't find the words to tell him he was being too hard on himself. She knew it wouldn't matter. She just leaned her head against his, her hand finding the back of his neck. Just promise me you'll be careful, she whispered. I don't want to lose you too. I promise. They stayed like that for a long time, the world outside forgotten. Peter remembered what Oz had said earlier about missed opportunities. He wasn't going to let this one go. He looked at her, and she looked back. A moment later, the space between them vanished. Is the injury feeling any better? She asked a moment later, her voice soft. I can't really feel the pain, Peter said. I can only feel my heart trying to beat out of my chest. Outside, perched on a ledge, Oz looked down at his wing. Another few feathers drifted away into the wind. He looked back through the window at the two of them, a strange, unreadable expression in his crimson eyes. You earned it, kid. The lizard incident hadn't gone the way the stories usually went, but ending it like this felt right. The lizard attack of the previous night had finally reached its conclusion. Dr. Rotha Irfan, the architect behind the chaos, was in custody. Oscorp was already flooding the airwaves with statements, claiming the doctor's actions were entirely unauthorized and urging the public to look elsewhere. Morning light poured into the house, bright and unforgiving. The drone of the news anchor drifted from the living room into the kitchen. Aunt May set the table, her voice lifting over the sound of the television. Peter, breakfast, coming. The response was immediate and full of energy. Peter practically flew down the stairs, his footsteps heavy and fast. He reached May and planted a quick kiss on her cheek. Morning, May. Awesome. Ham and cheese, my favorite. Morning, honey. Peter dropped into his chair and grabbed a sandwich. He was beyond hungry. His body had spent the last 8 hours fusing 14 broken bones back together, and every cell in his body was demanding fuel. He took a massive bite, but something was wrong. The sandwich was dry. He looked down. He was holding 2 thick slices of plain bread. The ham and cheese had vanished. He looked over to see Oz swallowing the last of the ham with a satisfied gulp. Why are you stealing my breakfast? Stealing? Oz asked, tilting his head. I left you the bread, didn't I? Carbs are good for you. Peter fumed. He considered reaching for the sausage on Oz's plate, but remembered May's meatloaf and decided the dry bread was a safer bet. You two are spending an awful lot of time together lately, May said, coming back from the kitchen. I've never seen you so willing to share with a pet, Peter. Trust me, May, I am not doing this by choice. Peter turned his attention to the TV. Captain George Stacy was at a podium, looking tired but resolute. I have to admit a mistake, Stacy was saying. Issuing a warrant for the individual known as Spider-Man was premature. Without his intervention last night, we would not have contained the threat so effectively. Peter felt a warm glow of pride. The warrant was gone. The police weren't hunting him anymore. Suddenly, the dry bread didn't taste so bad. May followed his gaze, looking at the captain on the screen. So, how was the dinner last night? Other than the lemon base. It was great. She's amazing. We had a really good time. Peter felt his face heat up as he looked back at his plate. Maybe you should invite her over here next time, May suggested. I will. Definitely. Peter nodded, then gestured toward the TV. Aren't you impressed, May? Spider-Man actually beat that giant lizard thing. It was all over the news. May shrugged, picking up her bowl and pouring the last of her cereal into Oz's dish. The crow looked at the soggy oats with a look of pure betrayal, as if asking what he was supposed to do with such garbage. May didn't notice. He seems like a good person, she said. That's it? Peter asked. Just a good person. He fought a monster, May. Well, he's a kind soul, isn't he? That counts for more than the fighting. May walked back into the kitchen, her mind already on the day ahead. May, he saved the city from a giant reptilian nightmare. Peter called after her. And I said he was a good person. Isn't that a compliment? Oz let out a sharp cackle and delivered a quick, painful peck to the back of Peter's head. Stop asking, the bird whispered. Why? Peter rubbed the spot, annoyed. Oz gestured with a wing toward a stack of papers tucked away on the corner of the sideboard. Peter narrowed his eyes, waiting until May had disappeared into the kitchen before he stood up and grabbed them. The first page was a bill. Rent. $514.70. For a 3-bedroom house with a basement and a yard, it was a fair price. It was a reasonable amount for a roof over their heads. But the household income had been cut in half. The weight of the world was resting on one person's shoulders now. May was paying for the house, the utilities, and Peter's education all on her own. Peter looked at the bill, his heart sinking. Why did she hide this? Because she doesn't want you dropping out to work at a gas station, Oz said. How long have you known about this? Longer than you. In the nights since Peter had put on the mask, Oz had often been the only one May talked to. She'd vent to the bird about her worries, the rising costs, and the struggle to keep things normal for Peter. She saw how smart her nephew was, and she refused to let her own stress ruin his future. I had no idea, Peter whispered. I'm out there bragging about fighting lizards, and she's drowning in bills. I need to apologize. I need to help her. The guilt was a heavy, cold stone in his stomach. He started toward the kitchen, but Oz hopped onto his shoulder, his claws digging in just enough to make him stop. I have an idea, Oz said. What? You want to help her, right? But if you go get a regular job, you'll fail your classes and you won't have time to be a hero. That's not helping. That's just making things worse. Peter looked at the bird, his expression desperate. Then what am I supposed to do? Give me something real, Oz. There's a job you can do. It's flexible. It pays well. You can do it while you're out in the suit, and it won't affect your life at all. Pure freelance. Stop talking in circles. Just tell me what it is. Think about it, Parker. Jobs are hard to find. You're young, you've got no experience, and most places won't work around your schedule. The high-paying stuff is corporate, and they'd never hire a kid. You need something modern, something digital. Peter held his breath, waiting for the punchline. He forced himself not to swat the bird away. If this is a good idea, say it. If it isn't, I'm locking you in the basement. Oz cleared his throat, or at least made a sound that mimicked it. He leaned in close to Peter's ear, his tone perfectly serious. You should start an OnlyFans. What? Peter was a shut-in at heart. He knew exactly what that term meant. His face went a shade of red that put most love letters to shame. I knew nothing good ever came out of your mouth. What are you getting so worked up for? It's a solid plan. What's the problem? Oz asked. Peter let out a frustrated, hysterical laugh. What was the problem? This bird was suggesting he sell his body for cash and he was asking what the problem was. You're trampling on my dignity. My character. I'd be throwing the Parker family name into the gutter. Peter yelled. You're overreacting. You wear a mask, don't you? You don't even have to show your face. Gwen wouldn't have to know. She'd find out and she'd laugh at me. I'm not doing it. Peter turned his head away sharply, then remembered Oz was still perched on his shoulder. He tried to swat him away, but his hand met nothing but air. Oz remained perfectly balanced on his other shoulder. Oh, so you want to make money while standing up? Oz asked. Exactly. Won't happen. Why not? I've got 2 hands and 2 feet. I can find plenty of work. Sure, if you want to spend 8 hours a day at a register. That'll really help your grades and your career as a vigilante. Peter went quiet. He didn't have a comeback for that. He kept his posture rigid, determined to ignore the bird's career advice. I am not doing that kind of work, he said. That's a shame. I thought you'd be into the idea of selling photos to the press. It's basically the family business for your variants. Oz hopped down from Peter's shoulder and strolled back to the table to finish a stray slice of cheese. Wait, what? The press? Peter turned around. You mean selling photos of Spider-Man to a newspaper? What else would I mean? Oz asked, then let out a long, exaggerated sound. Wait, did you think I meant? Oh, you wanted to do the other thing. I mean, I'd watch it. I've seen enough cosplay videos to know there's a market for. Peter ignored the rest of the sentence. Why didn't I think of that? The papers would be desperate for high-quality shots of Spider-Man, especially after what happened with Rotha last night. The pay would be huge. I could actually help May with the rent. He didn't wait for Oz to respond. He bolted for his room, grabbing the old camera he hadn't touched in months and stuffing it into his backpack. He'd take a few self-portraits on the way to school. Oz shrugged. Selling photos to the press was a classic Spider-Man trope. It made sense that Jonah Jameson would have a love-hate relationship with a guy who spent all day posing on the sides of buildings. Filled Diamond. Dr. Connors didn't spend the night in a cell. Not long after George Stacy had taken him in for questioning, a team of high-priced lawyers arrived to secure his bail. The police had grumbled about it, but they couldn't fight the legal weight of Oscorp. Everyone knew the incident was tied to the company, but without hard evidence, there was no way to make a formal charge stick. The Oscorp legal machine was efficient. They pinned the entire mess on Dr. Rotha, distancing the board from the rogue scientist, and making it seem like he'd acted entirely on his own. Connors was back in his home office, pouring a cup of steaming coffee. "Good morning, Professor." Connors didn't turn around. He took a slow sip of the coffee first. "If you're here for the serum, you're out of luck. The entire batch was destroyed during the fight with Rotha." The man standing behind him shook his head. "He wasn't there for a vial. Don't I get a cup?" Connors poured a second cup and handed it over. The man took it, followed Connors' lead with a sip, and finally spoke. "The serum being destroyed isn't the issue. The formula is in your head, Kurt. As long as your brain is intact, we can build more." Connors frowned. "The formula is flawed, and you're the only scientist on the planet?" the man asked. Connors let out a weary sigh. He felt the weight of his situation settling back onto his shoulders. "Fine. What do you want from me?" "What do I want?" a raspy, grating voice answered. It sounded like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard, a sound that made the skin crawl. The man in the suit stepped to the side, making room for a figure in a high-tech, automated wheelchair. The chair whirred into the light. The man behind it leaned down to adjust a blanket. "Sir, the doctor said you should rest. Resting is for the dead, Mackin. A little fresh air won't kill me any faster than this disease will." "My apologies." Connors stared at the man in the chair. In just 6 months, Norman Osborn had become a ghost of his former self. The healthy, polished billionaire of New York high society was gone. In his place was a man consumed by decay. His skin looked like parchment, and his fingernails had grown long and hooked, looking more like talons than human nails. "Norman." "Kurt." Connors hesitated. "What is it you're looking for?" "A pulse." Norman took off his breathing mask and inhaled the air of Connors' home, as if it were somehow purer than the medical-grade oxygen on his chair. "I need you to start a new project," Norman said. "If you succeed, you'll have more wealth and prestige than you ever dreamed of." "A new experiment?" Connors shook his head. "I think you've seen the papers today, Norman. Genetic splicing isn't something we can control yet. It's a mistake." "Is it? Then what do you call the Spider-Man?" Norman asked. He might be an anomaly," Connors said quietly. Norman let out a dry, hacking laugh. It was a terrible sound. Even from several feet away, Connors felt a surge of revulsion. "It doesn't matter. The new experiment is about him. I want the Spider-Man. He'll never agree to it," Connors said. He knew Peter. The boy would never willingly become a lab rat for Oscorp. He doesn't have a choice. Norman's voice was cold and certain. "I'm not ready to die, Kurt. He's so fond of helping people. Why shouldn't he help me? Prepare the lab. Get everything ready for a full genetic workup on the vigilante. I'll have my people handle the collection." Connors was about to argue when a phone rang. It wasn't his. Mackin checked the caller ID and whispered to Norman. "It's your son, sir. Hang up. Or tell him I'm not dead yet and he can stop worrying about the inheritance." "I'm busy." Norman didn't seem to care that Connors was listening to his family drama. But Connors felt a pit forming in his stomach. He'd met Harry Osborn. The boy wasn't the vulture his father made him out to be. Connors sighed. "And if I refuse?" Norman steered his chair toward the door, leaving Connors with his back. "You don't have the right to refuse, Kurt. Remember who owns the ground you're standing on. $10. Wait, what? You're telling me high-res, close-up shots are only worth $10? You've got to be kidding me." "Kidding." The middle-aged man with the flat-top haircut and the toothbrush mustache let out a sharp, mocking bark of a laugh. He leaned over his desk, his expression turning cold and professional. "Look at this garbage. I want shots of him actually doing something criminal. What am I supposed to do with him posing like a gymnast? $10 is a gift, kid. Take it or leave it." This was John Jonah Jameson, the man who ran the Daily Bugle with an iron fist and a very loud voice. He slammed his hand down on the prints scattered across his mahogany desk. And another thing, Jameson shouted. Look at this suit. It's a mess. Especially the eyes. Are you sure you didn't just dress up in your backyard to try and scam me out of a paycheck? His voice rattled the office windows and carried clearly to every desk in the bullpen outside. The staff didn't even look up. They were used to the boss's tantrums. Peter, on the other hand, felt his face burning with a mix of embarrassment and anger. I didn't. Peter stammered. What was that? Speak up. I can't hear you over the sound of your own incompetence. I said I didn't stage them. And Spider-Man isn't a criminal. Peter's voice rose, matching Jameson's intensity. Oh, so you're the expert now. What, are you his best friend? Give me a break. Jameson picked up a cigar and prepared to clip it, but he caught a glimpse of Peter's youthful, frustrated face and set the cigar back down. $10. Final offer. It's worth at least 20, Peter tried to bargain. He had made the classic mistake of a novice negotiator, showing his hand too early. Jameson's eyes lit up like a shark scenting blood. $5. Say another word and I'll charge you for the space you're taking up in my office. Peter stood there, speechless and fuming. He had never been this angry, not even when Oz made jokes about his uncle. Step aside, kid, Oz's voice whispered in his ear. Let your Uncle Oz show you how it's done. What do you mean? Peter thought, confused. Just relax. Stop fighting me. I only have about 10 seconds to pull this off, so don't fight it. Peter did as he was told. He let the tension drain out of his shoulders. Suddenly, he felt a strange, light sensation, as if his consciousness were drifting upward. He watched from a corner of the ceiling as his own body stood there, perfectly still. Oz took control. Peter watched himself flick a stray lock of hair out of his eyes and take a slow, deliberate breath. $200. What? Jameson started to roar, ready to toss the kid out on his ear. This is a one-time offer, Oz said through Peter's mouth. His voice was smooth, cool, and carried a weight Peter never had. If I walk out that door, these photos go to the New York Times. I'm sure the number 2 paper in the city would love to have a scoop that puts them on top for a change. Peter watched himself flick a stray lock of hair out of his eyes, a practiced, nonchalant gesture he'd seen in a dozen action movies. Jameson saw right through the performative cool. The kid was clearly playing a part, but the threat about the Times hit a nerve. You're a little shark, aren't you? Fine. Deal. Jameson slammed his hand on the desk again, the sound like a gunshot. To Peter, who was suddenly snapped back into his own body, the noise was deafening. He blinked, the world righting itself as he regained control of his limbs. Oz. God, that's a workout. Oz's voice sounded perfectly normal, though a bit tired. I was cutting it close on the timing. Peter took a shaky breath. He decided right then that he wasn't going to let Oz possess him again. It was too disorienting. The office door creaked open, and a secretary walked in with a check for $200, issued by the Daily Bugle. Peter took it with trembling hands, staring at the numbers. It was just a piece of paper, but it represented more than just money. It was proof he could provide for his family. Remember, kid, Jameson said, chomping on his unlit cigar. If I see a single Spider-Man photo in the Times, you're dead in this town. Peter gave him a mock salute. Understood, sir. He turned to leave, but Oz's voice stopped him. Hold on. Grab a piece of candy from that jar on his desk. I've been eyeing those for an hour. Peter looked at the candy jar, then at Jameson's sour expression. Now, are you sure? Don't break your partner's heart, Parker. Fine. Peter cleared his throat. Mr. Jameson. Jameson looked up, his face reddening again. He slammed his desk for the third time. Now what? Can I have a piece of candy? Quote. Jameson picked out the smallest, saddest-looking hard candy and tossed it at Peter. Peter caught it and turned to run, but Jameson's voice barked out one last time. Wait, you haven't signed the freelance contract. I'm a minor, sir. I can't sign legal documents. Peter didn't stick around to see Jameson's face turn purple. He practically flew out of the Daily Bugle building. Once he was on the sidewalk, he unwrapped the candy and offered it to the crow on his shoulder. How is it? Oz took a peck and immediately spat it out. Disgusting. Not my brand at all. Great. Thanks for that. So, how are we spending the 200? Oz asked, his tone shifting back to business. That's a lot of fries, Parker. Don't let me down. Peter thought about it. He needed a few bucks for web fluid supplies and maybe a few upgrades for the suit. But the priority was clear. 150 goes to May, Peter said. The rest is for us. Spoken like a man with a conscience. Well, what are you waiting for? Let's go turn that paper into potato gold. Peter smiled and headed for the bank. But as he stepped out from the teller's window, his phone began to buzz. It wasn't May, and it wasn't Gwen. It was Dr. Connors. Afternoon, drive. Connors. Afternoon, Peter. On the other end of the line, Connors was sitting at his desk, his one good hand rubbing the bridge of his nose. He sounded exhausted. Are you out being Spider-Man right now? No, sir. Why? Is something wrong? Good, Connors whispered. Doctor, what is it? You remember where I live, Peter. We need to talk. Right now. Peter hung up the phone and glanced at Oz, who was still perched on his shoulder. His expression was a silent question. What is going on? Oz immediately leaned in, his crimson eyes narrowing as they bore into Peter's. You're planning to hold out on my fries, aren't you? What? No, of course not. Peter pushed the bird's head away with 2 fingers. I'm just wondering what drive Connors wants to talk about. Probably your old man, Oz said. Peter went quiet. He remembered the shared memory Oz had shown him. Connors and Rotha had mentioned his father before everything went to hell. Truth be told, the image of his father was a blur. He had vague memories of playing hide and seek, and then being dropped off at Ben and May's house. He hadn't seen his parents since. Ben had been more of a father to him than Richard Parker ever was. But now Ben was gone. The burning desire he'd once had to uncover his father's secrets had cooled into something smaller and more complicated. Still, he knew he had to see Connors. It was entirely possible the doctor had news that had nothing to do with Richard. Where are you going? McDonald's is that way. There's a Burger King near the doctor's house. They sell fries too, Peter said. I only do the Golden Arches. Sorry. Filled Diamond. Connors opened the door and blinked at the sight on his porch. He saw Peter, and right next to him, a large black crow currently occupied with a fry. The doctor stared at the pair for a long moment. Since when did you get a crow, Peter? Peter realized Oz had chosen to be visible this time. He rubbed the back of his neck. Just a recent thing. We just kind of clicked. Connors nodded, his eyes lingering on the bird. Crows are high-intelligence creatures. They aren't just omens of death. In some cultures, they're a sign of luck. Luck, Peter thought. Doctor, if you heard the half of what this bird says, you'd think the devil had a pet. He caught himself looking at Connor's empty sleeve. Why doesn't he eat with 2 hands? Oh, right. No hand. Peter shook his head, mentally blaming Oz for the intrusive thought. So, doctor, why did you ask me here? Connors poured Peter a cup of coffee. He caught the crow staring at him, its gaze suggesting it was waiting for a cup of its own. We'll get to that, Peter, Connors said. For now, just think of this as a conversation between an old friend and a student. All right. Peter took a sip of the coffee. I've been thinking about something since last night, Peter. What exactly is it that drives you to be the Spider-Man? Connors sat down on the sofa across from him. Does May know about this? Peter shook his head. No, and I don't want her to. She'd never stop worrying. Connors placed a gentle, steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. So why'd it? Because I have the power to help people. That's it. Is that really all? Yeah, that's all. Connors sat in silence for a moment, weighing Peter's words. Is it because of Ben? Peter froze. He looked at the doctor, stunned by how easily the man had pierced through to the core of the truth. He didn't want to explain it again. He'd told Gwen, and once was enough. Some things were meant to stay buried. He simply nodded and looked down at his coffee. Connors sighed softly, his expression turning to one of admiration. You really are like your father, Peter. Peter watched his own reflection in the dark liquid of his cup. Ben used to say that too. Do you have anything else on him? Anything new? I'm sorry, Peter. When you gave me that formula, I told you everything I knew. There isn't anything left to tell. Peter wasn't surprised. He'd expected as much. So what is this really about? You didn't invite me here just to ask about the suit. Partially, Connors said. He leaned back into the cushions, looking more tired than Peter had ever seen him. I've been comparing you to other people lately, kid. Comparing me? Yes. You're what, 17? 17. You're so young, Connors said. I see kids your age every day. Some of them are brilliant, mapping out their entire lives. Others are just enjoying their youth while it lasts. But you're different. Peter felt a flush of embarrassment. He wasn't used to this kind of praise. You put on a ridiculous spandex suit and swing between skyscrapers. You push yourself to the limit to save people. I heard you even rescued a cat for a little girl the other day. Connors looked him directly in the eye. And from what I can tell, you don't ask for a dime in return. Doctor, you're making me look a lot better than I am, Peter muttered. Connors shook his head. Last night, when I was that monster, I could smell your fear. It wasn't the fear of a predator. It was something else. You weren't afraid of dying. A flicker of a memory crossed Connor's face, a remnant of the lizard's primitive instincts. You were afraid of failing. Am I right? Not exactly, Peter said. I gave you that formula. When things went wrong, I felt like the weight of it was on me. I wasn't afraid of failing. I was afraid that my mistakes would get someone else hurt. Connors studied the determination in Peter's eyes. He saw the confidence, the raw energy of a young man who believed he could fix the world. It was that very spark that made him say what he said next. Give it up, Peter. Peter blinked, sure he'd misheard. Stop being Spider-Man. Be a student. Be a brilliant scientist. You have a future ahead of you that is brighter than anything you can imagine. This path you're on, it's for your own good, and for May's. You have no idea what the coming days are going to take from you. Connors leaned forward. So walk away, kid. Before it's too late. Mr. Toombs. Adrian Toombs, a small man with a sharp, aquiline nose, was perched on the edge of the public sofa in the lobby. At the sound of his name, he practically jumped to his feet, clutching a paper cup as he hurried toward the young man who had spoken. How did it go? Toombs didn't mind that the assistant was decades younger than him. He wore a desperate, pleading expression. Did you show it to him? What did Mr. Osborn say? The potential for this technology is limitless, isn't it? The assistant swallowed hard, clearly preparing to deliver bad news. Toombs noticed and quickly held out his paper cup. Here, have some coffee. I just got it from the machine. The assistant frowned and took a step back. Toombs, oblivious to the social cue, pressed forward. Well, my designs. What did he think? Toombs' eyes were wide, fixed on the younger man. The assistant let out a weary sigh and pushed the cup away. I'm sorry, Mr. Toombs, he said. Oscorp finds your magnetic levitation designs to be incomplete. Crunch. The paper cup vanished inside Toombs' fist. Hot coffee sprayed across the assistant's expensive wool suit. Incomplete. Toombs' voice rose to a raspy shriek. I have spent 56 years of my life in this field. You're telling me it's incomplete. Who at this company has the right to judge my work? You're barely out of diapers. The assistant flinched, shocked by the old man's sudden explosion of rage. Toombs lunged forward, grabbing the man by his collar. Where are my blueprints? If they're so incomplete, give them back to me. Where are they? The blueprints are the property of Oscorp, Adrian. The voice was cold and carried the weight of absolute authority. Toombs turned his head. Norman Osborn stood a few feet away. His hair was slicked back perfectly, his suit cost more than Toombs' house, and he carried himself with the effortless confidence of a king. Norman gave a small wave of his hand, dismissing the assistant. He stepped forward to deal with the intruder himself. Give me back my designs, Norman. Toombs shouted, dropping any pretense of respect. Yours. Norman let out a short, dry chuckle. The magnetic levitation theory is sound enough, I suppose. But as for your blueprints, they carry a heavy suspicion of plagiarism. Plagiarism? You think I'd copy anything from Oscorp's flight division? Your tech is garbage. Pure, unadulterated garbage. Toombs had lived for this project. He had started it as a young man, refined it through middle age, and now, as he entered his twilight years, he had perfected it. No one knew this technology better than he did. No one. He had spent his life waiting to show the world what he had achieved, and now they were calling him a thief. The truth is, Toombs, Oscorp has been researching flight technology for years. Lies. Your research is a joke. A long, stinking pile of nothing. Toombs' eyes narrowed as a realization struck him. I see it now. You're going to steal it. You're going to take my work and put your name on it. Give me those papers. Toombs reached for Norman's lapel, but he had chosen the wrong target. Two massive security guards moved in instantly, stepping in front of their employer and blocking Toombs' path. Norman tapped one of the guards on the shoulder. The man stepped aside, allowing Norman to look down at the trembling old man. That is a very dangerous accusation, Mr. Toombs. Norman leaned in close. Dangerous and remarkably tedious. Listen to me, you little vulture. Norman placed a hand on Toombs' bald head. Toombs swatted it away, but the guards immediately grabbed his arms, pinning him in place. You've spent decades in this field and achieved absolutely nothing, Norman said, his voice a low, cruel hum. You needed me to even have the chance to show your face in this building. Oscorp stealing from you. That's the funniest thing I've heard all year. You had nothing to show for your youth, Adrian. Who is going to believe that an old man on the verge of the grave suddenly invented the future of flight? Norman flicked his fingers toward the door. Get him out of here. He smells like failure. Norman Osborn. The guards hauled Toombs away, his feet dangling off the floor. He let out a piercing, animalistic cry of rage. He kicked his legs in the air, struggling against their grip. You'll regret this, Osborn. You'll see. You're going to get exactly what's coming to you. Norman ignored the threats, turning his back on the scene. The blueprints would be sent to R&D immediately. They would give the company's flight division the edge they'd been looking for. He started to walk away when the sound of hurried footsteps caught his attention. Dad. Norman turned to see his son running toward him. He frowned. We've discussed this, Harry. An Osborn should always maintain his poise. You look like you're in a panic. Harry, looking thin and pale, stopped and caught his breath. I'm sorry, Dad. What is it? Do you need more money? I thought we discussed your budget. No, it's not the money. I have plenty. Harry cut his father off, his voice shaky. He had always been intimidated by the man, and it showed in the way he stood. I was thinking, maybe I don't have to transfer schools. I found a really good friend. I thought maybe. Slap. The sound of the strike echoed in the lobby. Harry staggered back, his hand flying to his reddened cheek. Tears welled in his eyes instantly. Look at you, Norman hissed. Weak. Cowardly. You look like a lost puppy. Have you forgotten what family you belong to? Osborn, Harry whispered. Norman looked at his son with visible disgust. There was nothing of himself in the boy. He took a deep breath to calm his nerves, but it triggered a violent fit of coughing. Harry moved forward to help, but Norman shoved his hand away. I don't need your help. I'm sorry. I was just worried. The coughing subsided, leaving Norman feeling drained. He glanced around, blaming the air quality for his outburst. Listen to me, Harry. His tone softened, but only slightly. The Osborns are cursed, he said. If you want to survive that curse, you have to grow up. You can't keep acting like a crying infant. Loneliness is our natural state. It's what reminds us of who we are. Friends and attachments. They're distractions. They're weights that will only pull you down. Do you understand? Harry wanted to say he didn't. He wanted to say that before he met his friend, he might have believed that lie. But under his father's cold, demanding gaze, the words wouldn't come. He dropped his head. I understand, Harry said. Give it up, Peter. Stop being Spider-Man. Peter's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. After everything they had been through, why was Connors telling him to quit? Doctor, why are you saying this? Peter wanted to stand up and demand an explanation, but his upbringing kept him rooted in his chair. I know, Connors said. He looked tired, his expression a mask of regret. We just finished dealing with the lizard crisis, and here I am telling you to hang up the suit. It's strange, I realize that. But you have to listen to me, Peter. You're in a dangerous position. Someone is watching you. Who? Peter asked. Norman Osborn. Oz let out a high-pitched, mocking squawk. By Morgan Freeman's beard, you've been tagged by another Uncle Ben. Peter clamped a hand over the bird's beak. He wanted to deal with Oz later, not now. Even with his beak held shut, Oz managed to keep talking through their mental link. Let me guess. Your little debut gave him a reason to live, and now he wants a sample of your blood for his own research. That Osborn guy is a real piece of work, isn't he? My advice: lay low for a year. Wait until he's on his deathbed, then show up and ask him if the little goblin is going to cry. It would be way more satisfying than actually helping him. Peter took a deep breath, ignoring the bird's commentary. He looked at Connors. Why me? I haven't done anything out of the ordinary. Remember the lizard serum? Of course you do, Connors said, his voice a bit frantic. That formula wasn't just about science. It was about saving Norman Osborn. He's dying, Peter. He's spent a fortune trying to find a cure, and now he thinks you're the answer. You don't understand how desperate a man like that can be. What if I just help him? Peter asked quietly. Connors went silent. He stared at Peter for a long moment, then let out a sharp, cynical laugh. It's not that simple, Peter. You don't know who he is. You don't know what he'll do with your blood once he has it. You're a genetic anomaly. Giving him your DNA is a risk you shouldn't take. He approached me today. He wanted me to prepare for a study on Spider-Man. He's changing, Peter. Not just physically, but his mind too. He's dangerous. For your own sake, and for May's, stay away from the suit for a while. Filled Diamond. Peter walked home with a heavy heart. Connor's words echoed in his head. Give it up, Peter. Just be Peter Parker for a while. He didn't know if he could do that. He became Spider-Man for Ben, but also for himself. He wanted to be the person who stepped up when others wouldn't. How could he just let someone die, even if they were dangerous? Especially if that someone was Harry's father. You're awfully quiet, Peter noted. Oz was flying through the trees, snapping branches and chasing off smaller birds with aggressive flaps of his wings. He knocked a sparrow off its perch and looked back. What is there to say? About what Connors said. About quitting. Then quit. It's a simple solution. But, never mind. Peter knew better than to expect a straight answer from the crow. Oz was helpful when it counted, but most of the time, he was just a nuisance. Peter let himself into the house. I'm home, May. Silence. He found a note on the kitchen table. Dinner is in the microwave. I have to work late tonight. T.T. The little drawing at the end made him smile, but the smile didn't last. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to push herself so hard. He wanted to tell her he had a plan to help. But if he followed Connor's advice and quit, his plan to sell photos to the Bugle would go down the drain. The guilt made his appetite vanish, but he knew he needed the energy. He took the food out of the microwave just as Oz flew back in. Through the window, ruffling his feathers. What's wrong with you? Peter asked. Someone told me there were rare gems hidden in bird nests around here. I've checked 20 and found nothing but twigs and bird spit. Oz hopped onto the table and looked at the meatloaf. I'm going to the docks. I need real food. He flew out again, leaving Peter alone in the quiet house. Peter finished his dishes and was about to head upstairs when his phone buzzed. Gwen. Good evening, Spider-Man, she said, her voice bright and teasing. Good evening, Gwen. Are you currently busy saving the world, or are you just sitting on the couch? Just sitting on the couch. Good, she said. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. You've hit the jackpot, Spidey, Gwen said through the phone. There's a new movie out tonight, and I happen to have 2 tickets. You in? A green streak cut across the skyline, a shimmering blur that vanished before most people could even look up. To those on the sidewalk, it was nothing more than a momentary flash of light, leaving 2 faint emerald trails that dissolved into the clouds. Most people ignored it. But Adrian Toombs was not most people. He stood on the crowded sidewalk, his eyes fixed on the spot where the light had vanished. He felt a bitterness in his throat that no amount of air could clear. Oscorp had taken everything. They had stolen his life's work, scrubbed his name from the patents, and turned his genius into a corporate asset. He wanted to scream, but New York was a city of screams. If he yelled, the only thing he'd get was a one-way trip to a holding cell for disturbing the peace. Norman Osborn, he hissed, the name tasting like ash. He had never hated a man more. His designs were being flown by others while he was reduced to this. Hey, Pops, how much for the toy? A young man in a varsity jacket picked up a small mechanical bird from Tomb's makeshift display. He turned it over in his hands, his eyes lighting up with genuine curiosity. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. The kid pressed a small button on its back, and the bird took flight, hovering with a precision that was almost eerie. His friends let out a low whistle of approval. Toombs watched them, feeling a conflicting surge of pride and shame. It was a masterpiece of micro-engineering, and it was being used as a distraction for teenagers. $50, Toombs said. 50. Are you serious? $50. No refunds. The young man laughed, looking at his friends. You're dreaming, old man. The official Oscorp gift shop has stuff better than this for half the price. Do not say that name to me. Toombs barked, his voice cracking with rage. Whatever, man. The kid swiped at the bird, knocking it out of the air. He blew a mock kiss and turned to walk away. One of his friends, following close behind, made a point of stepping on the fallen toy. The sound of plastic and delicate metal snapping was sickeningly clear. Stop. You get back here. Toombs tried to lunge after them, but he was an old man in a city of the young. He tripped over his own display, tumbling to the concrete. As he struggled to get up, another one of the teenagers kicked his table over, sending the rest of his inventory scattering across the sidewalk. Bastards. Toombs sat on the ground, his chest heaving. It was too much. He was supposed to be in a multi-million-dollar lab, surrounded by top-tier equipment and the respect of his peers. He was supposed to be a pioneer. He wasn't supposed to be begging for scraps on a street corner. A pair of hands reached out to help him up. Take it easy, a voice said. Peter Parker was already gathering the fallen toys before Toombs was even back on his feet. He picked up one of the mechanical birds, his eyes widening as he examined the underside. Wait, is this magnetic levitation? And the frame, it's a honeycomb lattice. That's incredible. It's light enough to stay airborne but solid enough to maintain the center of gravity. This is amazing. Peter looked at the wreckage of the bird that had been crushed, his brow furrowed in genuine distress. Active aerodynamic flaps. But ordinary materials shouldn't be able to handle this kind of frequency. Are you okay, sir? Toombs straightened his jacket, trying to recover some shred of dignity. He looked at the boy, surprised by the technical vocabulary. It's a shape memory alloy, he muttered. Cool, Peter breathed. Memory alloys. For a structure this small. That's genius. Why would you use that for a toy? Gwen Stacy knelt down beside Peter, helping him gather the last of the birds. She held one up, squinting at the fine detailing on the wings. She was first in her physics class, and Peter was a very close second. She understood exactly what they were looking at. I use what I have, Toombs snapped, his mood shifting back to bitterness. Gwen offered a small, polite smile, though she looked skeptical of the old man's attitude. Peter, however, was still hooked. How much? Peter asked. I really want to take one of these apart and see how the stabilizer works. $40. 40. Gwen asked, her eyes wide. For something this size, you can get a high-end Lego set for that. I wasn't asking you, girl. Toombs looked at Peter, waiting for the decision. He could see the boy was hooked. Peter reached for his wallet, but his hand hesitated. He thought about the rent bill sitting on May's table. $40 was a lot of money when you were counting every cent. Peter slowly set the bird back on the table, his expression falling. I'm sorry. I really want it, but it's just not in the budget right now. I'm sorry for the trouble. Gwen took Peter's arm, pulling him gently away. She could see the disappointment on his face, but she knew the bills came first. Wait, Toombs called out. The couple turned back. The old man looked like he was fighting an internal battle, his jaw set tight. He grabbed one of the birds and thrust it toward Peter. Take it, Toombs grumbled. No, I can't just take it. I can pay you $20 if that helps, or... I said take it. Don't make me say it twice. Toombs practically threw the toy at him. He didn't wait for a thank you. He began frantically stuffing the rest of the birds into his bag, his movements jerky and hurried. Within seconds, he had slung the bag over his shoulder and vanished into the crowd. "Weird guy," Gwen muttered. "Yeah," Peter agreed, looking down at the bird in his hand. He felt a strange weight of responsibility for the gift. Gwen shook her head and started walking again, pulling Peter with her. "Anyway, where were we? The movie or the critics?" "The critics, I think. Didn't you say they were raving about it before it even came out?" "I did. But I don't really want to talk about the movie anymore. Where's Oz? I haven't seen him since we left the theater." "Probably out stealing fries somewhere," Peter said. High above the New York skyline, a dark green, high-tech silhouette streaked toward Oscorp Tower. It wasn't exactly a landing, the figure descended in a controlled hover. Coming to rest on the massive H of the helipad. He waited for a few seconds as the mechanical plates groaned and shifted. The helipad split open like a puzzle, revealing a dark, bottomless shaft. The pilot plummeted inside. "Filled Diamond. Report on today's progress, Dragoon." The voice crackled through the comms as Dragoon touched down on the interior platform. Mechanical arms hissed as they began to strip the flight rig from his body. "Nothing, sir," Dragoon said. "I circled the city for 12 hours. No sign of Spider-Man. I didn't even find any fresh webbing. That's unusual. According to our projections, he should have been active." Dragoon felt a wave of relief as the heavy flight gear was lifted away. "Maybe the fight with the lizard took more out of him than we realized. He could be laying low, recovering." A dry, hacking cough came from the shadows. Dragoon went silent immediately. Norman Osborn rolled into the light, his wheelchair whirring softly. Behind him, a small army of medical staff followed like nervous ghosts, watching his every move as if he might crumble at any second. Since Spider-Man's debut, Norman had been possessed by a manic, desperate energy. If he had suddenly decided to stand up and put on the flight suit himself, no one in the room would have been surprised. "How does the gear handle?" Norman asked. "Perfectly, Mr. Osborn," Dragoon replied. Norman gave a curt nod. "Report any glitches immediately. I won't have any setbacks." The medical team stepped forward, murmuring that it was time for his rest. Norman let out a long sigh, his face a mask of exhaustion. The genetic disease had ravaged him over the last 6 months, leaving him looking more like a corpse than a man. To Norman, Spider-Man and the cross-species research were 2 plates of food set before a starving man. One plate was poisoned, the lizard. He wasn't ready to touch it unless he had no other choice. But the other plate, Spider-Man, had been snatched away just as he was reaching for it. He was running out of time, and he knew it. "Where are you, Spider-Man?" he whispered. A sharp, sudden sound echoed through the sterile bay. "Caw!" Everyone froze. The bay was a sealed environment. There were no open windows, no vents large enough for a bird. Norman looked up. A large black crow was circling the rafters, its feathers sleek and glossy under the industrial lights. The medical staff looked at each other, their discomfort visible. Even in a room full of scientists, superstition had a way of creeping in. A crow in a sealed room was an omen, a harbinger of the end. "Mr. Osborn," one of the guards said, his hand moving to his holster. "Should I take care of it?" Norman raised a hand, a sickly smile touching his lips. "They say you're a symbol of death, bird. But for some, you're a sign of change." The crow landed on the metal floor. Its eyes were bright and intelligent as it watched them. It took a step toward the wheelchair. Then another. Its gait was strange, a slow, exaggerated waddle that looked like something out of a cartoon. It was sneaking. The staff watched in stunned silence. The bird was moving with a comical, suspicious grace, its sharp claws clicking against the metal floor. It looked like a thief in a pantomime. It reached the wheelchair and hopped onto Norman's lap. Before anyone could react, the bird leaned forward and grabbed the oxygen line connected to Norman's breathing apparatus. Hop. With a sharp tug, the crow pulled the tube clean out. "You little, get it. Kill it." The crow didn't wait. It took off, its wings beating a frantic rhythm as it blurred across the room. A guard drew his pistol and fired a flurry of shots, the bullets pinging harmlessly off the metal bulkheads. Caw caw caw. The sound of the bird's cry echoed through the bay, sounding remarkably like a laugh. By the time the smoke from the gunshots cleared, the bird was gone. It had vanished into thin air. Norman's breathing became ragged. A medic rushed forward to reattach the line, but Norman shoved him away, his face turning a deep, angry purple. "Spider-Man!" he roared. He looked at Dragoon, his eyes wide and wild. "Get back in the suit. Find him. I want him found tonight." He blamed the hero. The bird was a message, a mocking reminder that his time was up. He wasn't going to die gasping for air while a masked brat played hero in the streets. "Sir, your oxygen line," the medic whispered, pointing to the tube on the floor. "Get a new one. And you're fired." What exactly is Oz's superpower? Stealing people's fries. That's not a superpower, Peter. Peter laughed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Honestly, he talks about it so much that I just assumed. I haven't actually seen him pull it off yet." Gwen smiled, picturing the bird's sharp tongue and even sharper attitude. "So, how did you even meet a crow like that?" They were walking along a wooded path, the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. For Peter, this time alone with Gwen was a rare pocket of peace. It felt as though the weight of the city and the shadows of the hospital had finally lifted. "He showed up the night Uncle Ben died," Peter said. Gwen's expression softened instantly. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought it up." "It's okay." Peter squeezed her hand. He led her to a bench near the edge of the path and sat down, letting out a long, heavy breath. It was the sound of a man finally dropping a burden he had been carrying for miles. Gwen watched him. She gripped his hand and gave it a small, reassuring squeeze. "What is it, Peter?" "Nothing. Your eyes are terrible liars." Peter gave her a weak, lopsided grin. "Come on, Mr. Spider-Man. Out with it," she nudged. Peter took a moment to find the words. He decided he needed to talk about what had happened with Connors. "I had a talk with Dr. Connors this afternoon, and he told me to stop. He wants me to give up being Spider-Man." "That's great. I mean, wait. Why?" Peter looked at her, his eyes wide with shock. He'd caught that first word loud and clear. "You don't want me to be Spider-Man either." "What? No, I didn't mean it like that." Gwen bit her lip. She needed to filter her thoughts more carefully. "It feels like everyone is saying the same thing lately. Peter, listen to me." Gwen turned to face him, taking his face in her hands. She could see the frustration in him, the classic teenage feeling of being misunderstood by everyone. She knew he needed support, even if a part of her selfishly agreed with the doctor. "I'm sorry, Gwen. I'm not trying to be moody. It's just, Connors tells me to quit. Oz basically tells me to do whatever, which isn't helpful. And now you. Does it feel like everyone is telling you that you're wrong?" "A little, yeah." Gwen didn't answer with words. She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, lingering touch that silenced his rambling. When she pulled back, she kept her hands on his cheeks. "Can you listen now?" she whispered. Peter nodded. "Every morning since I was a little girl, I've watched my father put on his uniform," Gwen said. "I watch him pin on his badge, check his service weapon, and walk out that door. Every single day. And every single day, I have to live with the fact that he might not come back for dinner. I think I'm the only person who truly understands why they want you to stop. They're afraid for you, Peter. I'm afraid for you. But what am I supposed to do? Tell my father to quit. Tell him I just want him to be a dad and nothing else. He'd tell me that it's his responsibility. It's his duty." She looked deep into his brown eyes. "It's the same for you. You became Spider-Man because of what happened to your uncle. It wasn't just for him. It was because you felt a responsibility to use what you have. I want you to stop because I don't want you to get hurt. But I also know I can't ask you to do that. The choices you make, the things you do, they define who you are. No one can talk you out of being the person you've decided to be." Peter felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know what to say. "Gwen." He reached out to pull her closer, wanting to lose himself in the moment. He really wanted to kiss her again. A loud, wet sound like someone blowing their nose violently shattered the air. The romantic tension evaporated instantly. "That was beautiful," a voice croaked. "I wish this moment could last forever. I really do. It would almost make up for the psychological trauma I've suffered in other timelines. To hell with Paul. I'm going to hunt that man across the multiverse. Oz was sitting on the back of the bench, clutching a white tissue and dabbing at his eyes. Peter and Gwen just stared at him. They had no idea what he was talking about, but the moment was officially dead. Gwen reached out and grabbed the crow by his neck. "If you ever do that again, I will pluck every single feather off your body," she spat. Oz looked at her with wide, innocent red eyes. "That's a bit much, don't you think? Besides, I'm molting anyway. It's a natural process." Gwen let out an exasperated sigh and let him go. She slumped back against the bench, covering her face with her hands. "I really want to know what goes on in that tiny brain of yours." "Fries, mostly," Oz replied after a second of genuine thought. Peter laughed. The heaviness of the day had finally dissipated, thanks to Gwen's words and Oz's, whatever that was. "So, where were you anyway?" Peter asked. "I thought for sure you'd be at the docks by now." "Actually, I took a break from the fries today," Oz said, ruffling his feathers. "Then where did you go?" "I went to pull someone's oxygen tube." Peter blinked. "You what?" Late that night, after dropping Gwen off, Peter returned home with Oz. For a woman of Aunt May's age, it was already well past bedtime, and the house was quiet as she rested in the world of dreams. Peter wasn't tired yet. He sat at his desk, hunched over the tattered remains of his Spider-Man suit, carefully stitching the fabric back together. "Where's the money?" "What money?" Peter asked without looking up. "The check from the Bugle. You said you'd set some aside for new suit materials. So why am I looking at a pile of fries and you with a needle and thread?" Oz watched the boy's fingers work with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Peter smiled, his focus remaining on the stitch. "I was going to buy new fabric, but this suit still has some life in it. A few patches here and there will keep it going for a while longer. Better to save the cash for a rainy day." Oz let out a noncommittal sound and rolled over on the floor. His gaze caught on a small metallic object nearby. He hopped up and snagged the mechanical bird model Peter had received earlier, turning it over in his beak. "What's this?" "An interesting invention from a guy the first met while walking with Gwen." "Oh, that reminds me. What did you mean about pulling someone's oxygen tube? You didn't actually do that, did you?" Peter set the needle down and looked Oz in the eye. "Pulling a tube." To Gwen, it probably sounded like another one of the bird's erratic jokes. But Peter knew better. Oz had a habit of making his wildest claims come true. "Well, you're back in the suit now," Oz said. "You'll find out in a few days." Peter stared at him for a moment. "You don't seem surprised that I decided to stay Spider-Man." "Surprised? It's the standard procedure." Oz settled back onto the floor, his wings twitching idly. The hero starts, the hero quits for personal reasons, and then the hero realizes they can't turn a blind eye and comes back. It's a classic cycle. Peter wanted to push for more, but Oz cut him off. "Enough talking. I'm going to sleep. Good night." With that, Oz shut his eyes and went stiff. To Peter's amazement, a large, translucent bubble began to grow from the bird's nostrils, expanding and contracting with every rhythmic breath. Peter leaned in, fascinated. He reached out a finger to poke the bubble. The moment his skin made contact, the bubble didn't pop. Instead, a sharp, stinging pain slapped across Peter's cheek, as if he'd been struck by a physical hand. "You jerk," Peter grumbled, rubbing his face. He realized he wasn't going to get anything more out of the bird. He went back to his sewing, working until the last hole was patched. He stretched, a long yawn escaping him, and draped his civilian jacket over the sleeping crow. He picked up the mechanical bird from the table and climbed into bed, turning the gadget over in his hands. "Pulling a tube," he whispered. He stared at the ceiling, trying to connect the dots, but the exhaustion finally won. If Oz said he'd find out soon, he just had to wait. Filled diamond. It was a normal day in New York, right up until it wasn't. A green blur streaked across the sky, followed by a second, smaller shadow. A pair of patrol officers stopped in their tracks, squinting at the sun. "This is Adam reporting. We have a visual over the north end of Baker Street. Spider-Man is engaged with a high-tech flyer. We need." The officer reached for his radio, but the fight was moving too fast. The green figure snagged a web line and dragged Spider-Man out of sight before the report could even be finished. "Officer, please repeat. What is your status?" Forget it. They've already cleared the sector. Filled Diamond. Hey, pal, I'm pretty sure we haven't been introduced. Spider-Man gripped his web line tight, looking up at the figure towing him through the air. The man was encased in a sleek, emerald flight suit with massive steel wings that blocked out the sun. It doesn't matter if you know me, the pilot, Dragoon, barked over the rush of the wind. You're coming with me. Dragoon rolled his frame in midair, his back-mounted thrusters swiveling to dump a massive burst of acceleration. Whoa! The sudden jerk nearly threw Peter off his rhythm, but his reflexes were honed by months of high-altitude swinging. He adjusted his center of gravity and fired a second line at a nearby skyscraper, pulling back hard to anchor Dragoon's momentum. First of all, Peter didn't want to get into a tug of war. He'd learned against the lizard that raw strength was less effective than leverage. He suddenly released the anchor line, letting the tension slingshot him toward the flyer. He closed the gap in a heartbeat, slamming a fist into Dragoon's armored visor. Usually, when you want a date, you say please. Is it that hard? Or are you just rude? Because if this is how you treat people, I'm definitely not going with you. Peter's quips landed as fast as his punches, leaving Dragoon dazed for a split second. Peter leapt onto the flyer's back. He hesitated. Should he rip out the power core or try to jam the thrusters? Dragoon recovered faster than expected. The steel wings on his back buckled inward with a mechanical whine, the tips sharpening into lethal blades that lunged for Peter's ribs. Holy shoot! Peter threw himself into a backflip, narrowly avoiding the metal. But Dragoon had anticipated the move. A grapple hook launched from his wrist gauntlet, looping around Peter and pinning his arms to his sides. Are you serious? You're actually kidnapping me now. Peter struggled against the cable, but the fiber was high tensile and coated in something that made it tighten the more he fought. Shut your mouth, Dragoon growled, opening the throttles to maximum. Every time Peter tried to gain leverage to snap the cord, Dragoon would roll or dive, keeping the vigilante off balance. Just as Dragoon thought the mission was in the bag, a third voice joined the conversation. It wasn't Spider-Man. This is exactly what I meant about the breathing tube, Oz said. The Black Crow was suddenly flying alongside them, his wings beating effortlessly as he kept pace with the high-tech suit at over 100 miles per hour. It's you, you damn bird. Dragoon hadn't forgotten the crow. If it hadn't been for this bird pulling his boss's oxygen line the night before, he wouldn't be stuck. Pulling double shifts over the New York skyline. He lashed out with a clawed hand, trying to snatch Oz out of the air. Peter fired a web line, blinding Dragoon's visor and forcing him to bank away. Peter's mind raced, finally putting the pieces together. Oz hadn't been joking. He had actually infiltrated Oscorp and unplugged Norman Osborn's life support. And now, a very angry billionaire was sending his personal goons to hunt down the only person connected to the bird. I hate you, Oz. Peter screamed into the wind. Hate me? Fine. Be that way. And here I was, actually considering helping you cut those high-tensile cables. But since I'm so despised, I'll take my leave. Ciao. In Peter's blurred vision, Oz vanished with a sharp pop, dissolving into a cloud of white smoke that was instantly torn away by the gale. It was as if the bird had never been there at all. You son of a... Even with Peter's usually saint-like patience, the bird's impeccable timing and sheer audacity were enough to make him snap. He didn't even get to finish the curse before a stinging, physical slap connected with his jaw, rattling his teeth inside his mask. Language, Peter. Civility costs nothing. Oz's voice rang in his head. Peter groaned, the metallic taste of adrenaline in his mouth. He was seriously reconsidering his partnership with the crow. But as he struggled against the grapple wire, he realized the slap hadn't just been for discipline. The cables binding his arms had slackened, the tension suddenly giving way. He huffed, feeling a bit foolish. Fine, he thought. The slap was a fair trade for the leverage. Above him, Dragoon was frantically clawing at the thick, opaque webbing covering his high-tech visor. He scanned the open sky, head swiveling in a panic, searching for the black omen that had been taunting him. The sky appeared empty, and for a second, Dragoon wondered if the thin air at this altitude was finally inducing hallucinations. Then, the entire flight rig jerked violently. A red and blue fist, packed with the momentum of a falling star, slammed into his face. Say hello to the pavement, you overgrown tin bird. The force was triple what it had been in their first exchange. Dragoon watched through a spider web of fractured glass as his reinforced visor began to disintegrate. In that terrifying heartbeat, a realization struck him: Spider-Man hadn't even been trying until now. He'd been pulling his punches. Dragoon felt a sickening wave of relief that the vigilante was apparently a good guy. If the kid had been aiming to kill, Dragoon's skull would have been reduced to a fine powder against the interior of his own helmet. Spider-Man, wait. Listen to me. Save it. You had your chance to talk before the kidnapping and the midair wrestling started. Now, we're doing this my way. Peter dug his fingers into the seams of the emerald flight suit and heaved with everything his enhanced muscles could offer. He steered their combined mass toward a nearby skyscraper, a sprawling concrete terrace jutting out from a luxury apartment complex. Dragoon's thrusters let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine as the computer tried to compensate for the erratic trajectory, but Peter was already 3 steps ahead. Peter fired 2 thick strands of webbing, anchoring them to the roof's heavy gargoyles. He yanked back hard, using the tension to slingshot them into a controlled, bone-jarring crash. The sound of reinforced boots slamming into the metal chest plate of the flight suit echoed across the empty terrace. Dragoon hit the concrete with a thud that felt like an earthquake. Sparks showered the roof as the broad, steel wings shrieked against the stone, carving deep furrows into the surface. Peter landed lightly beside him, his knees absorbing the impact with practiced grace. He'd made sure to angle the crash so the armor took 80% of the shock. Dragoon was breathing, but he wasn't going anywhere. The power cells in his rig flickered, buzzed, and died. Peter reached down, gripped the edge of the pilot's buckled helmet, and tore it open like a tin can. Dragoon looked up, his face pale and slicked with sweat, his eyes wide with a very human terror. He instinctively raised a trembling hand to shield his face. Please, don't. I don't kill, pal. Relax. Just breathe, Peter said, tossing the mangled helmet aside. It clattered across the roof with a hollow, metallic ring. Dragoon let out a shaky, rattling breath. I didn't want this. I have a job. Oscorp. If I failed, I was finished. My family, that's a pretty lousy excuse for a kidnapping, don't you think? Peter pointed a gloved finger at him, his voice stern. I know. Dragoon tried to sit up, but his limbs felt like leaden weights. He managed to prop himself up on his elbows, gasping. I didn't have a choice. He's obsessed. Oz suddenly materialized on Peter's shoulder, looking entirely too smug. He began preening a wing as if he hadn't just caused a midair disaster. I love this part, the crow croaked. They always start with the missiles and the "you're coming with me" routine, and then the moment the armor cracks, they're all victims of the economy. Poor me, I'm just a cog in the machine. I didn't mean to abduct the teenager. Give me a break. Peter shot the bird a sharp, side-eye glare. Was it really necessary to unplug Norman Osborn's life support, Oz? You realized you basically poked a hornet's nest with a very short stick, right? I merely accelerated the inevitable, Parker. He was going to hunt you down regardless of my intervention. It's not my fault the man is a walking case study for psychopathy. You need to learn to distinguish between the arsonist and the guy who just handed him the matches. Peter rolled his eyes beneath the mask. Leave it to Oz to frame a provocation as a public service. Is he at least alive? Oh, he's vibrant. I'm fairly certain his blood pressure is currently high enough to power the city's electrical grid. Oz suddenly let out a sharp, piercing squawk, his head snapping toward the horizon. Gotta go. The family reunion is about to get crowded. The bird vanished in a blink. Peter felt the base of his skull begin to thrum, a low, rhythmic buzzing that quickly grew into a frantic alarm. His spider sense was screaming. He scanned the skyline, searching for a missile or a drone, but the air seemed empty. Yet, the warning didn't fade. It intensified. What's wrong? Dragoon asked, seeing the vigilante's sudden tension. Peter didn't answer. He turned his gaze toward the southern sky. A tiny, dark speck was growing larger at an impossible rate, cutting through the clouds with a speed that made Dragoon's suit look like a toy. He could hear it now, a deep, industrial whistle of wind being carved by metal. Peter dropped into a low combat crouch, his fingers tensing against the concrete. Is this more Oscorp backup? Dragoon looked at the approaching shadow and shook his head weakly. That's not our signature. A roar of engines filled the air, deeper and grittier than Dragoon's polished thrusters. An emerald figure banked over the roof, its silhouette broad and jagged. This one didn't have a full helmet, a bald head was visible above a high-collared, reinforced flight suit. The wings were vibrant, serrated, and looked hand-forged, a masterpiece of brutalist engineering. "You!" Peter shouted, recognizing the sharp nose and the defiant bald head. It was the old man from the sidewalk, the one with the mechanical birds. Adrian Toombs, now more vulture than man, narrowed his eyes as he hovered 20 feet above the terrace. "You recognize me, do you? I don't think we were officially introduced, but I recognize the angry bird aesthetic," Peter said, gesturing to the downed Dragoon. "I'm guessing you're the guy's disgruntled uncle. You both clearly shop at the same wing specialty store. It's Vulture." Toombs roared, his voice a gravelly rasp that echoed off the surrounding buildings. "Fine, Vulture it is. Just don't expect me to start a fan club." Peter thought to himself that naming yourself after a scavenger while having a receding hairline was a bold choice, but he kept the quip internal. Dragoon squinted up at the newcomer. Adrian Toombs, the independent contractor. Toombs' gaze shifted to the pilot, his eyes turning to ice. "So, the corporate lapdogs do know the name of the man they robbed." Dragoon let out a dry, hacking laugh. With his comms fried, he had nothing left to lose. The rumors were right then. "You really did design the core of this flight rig. The board said it was internal R&D, but I knew the math was too clean for those hacks." Peter looked between the two of them. Toombs' suit looked older, more scavenged, but the core engineering was identical. If Toombs was the architect, it made no sense for him to be wearing the prototype while the goons wore the production model. "I have a question," Peter said, raising a hand. "If you invented this, why does your suit look like it was built in a scrap yard, while his looks like it came out of a luxury car showroom?" Toombs' face turned a mottled, angry red. "Norman Osborn. He stole the patents. He scrubbed my name from the history books and kicked me to the curb like common trash. You think I wanted to build this in a garage? He took my life, my reputation." Peter sighed. Harry's father really was the gift that kept on giving. It was no wonder Oz had wanted to mess with the man's oxygen. As if on cue, the crow reappeared on Peter's shoulder, this time sporting a pair of miniature, bright yellow sunflower sunglasses. "Seriously?" Peter whispered. Oz removed the glasses with a wing, his expression suddenly grim. "Parker, I think it's time we go invite Norman to a very permanent retirement party. Preferably one involving a lot of fire." "I'm not burning down a skyscraper, Oz," Peter said firmly. Oz swatted at Peter's head. "You have no sense of theatricality." Peter ignored him and looked back at Toombs. "I'm going to Oscorp. I've had enough of being the prey. It's time I had a face-to-face with Mr. Osborn." "You're walking into a slaughterhouse, boy," Toombs said, his wings beating a slow, steady rhythm. He looked down at the ruined Dragoon, then back at Peter. A strange, twisted sense of professional respect flickered in his eyes. "I owe you. You handled the corporate Vulture for me. I've been tracking that suit for 3 days, trying to get my hands on the black box." "I'll give you a lift," Toombs added. "I'm headed to that tower anyway. I have some unfinished business with the man in the chair." "I'll take you up on that," Peter said. Filled Diamond. At Oscorp Tower. The silence in the surveillance hub was suffocating. A dozen technicians stood over a bank of monitors that were showing nothing but static. Dragoon's biometric feed had flatlined minutes ago, and his GPS had stopped on a rooftop 4 blocks away. "Sir, the signal is gone. We've lost visual." Norman Osborn sat in his high-tech wheelchair, his face a mask of cold, calculated fury. Since the crow had tampered with his life support, his breathing had become shallow and labored. He was connected to a fresh tank now, the tubes taped firmly to his face. "Send the secondary team," Norman rasped. "Sir," a technician interrupted, his hands flying across a keyboard. "We have multiple high-speed signatures approaching." "Wait, 3 targets." "3. Norman's eyes narrowed. The tech switched to a long-range thermal feed. In the center of the frame, a massive emerald figure with serrated wings was hauling a red and blue shadow through the sky. Dragoon's limp suit was being carried in the vulture's talons like a trophy. Peter was clinging to Tomb's back, his mask whipping in the high-altitude winds. Norman's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. "Tombs, you old fool." He let out a sharp, rattling breath. "Alert Octavius and Connors. The spider has stopped running. He's coming to us." Norman steered his chair away from the monitors. He had no intention of being in the room when the punching started. He wanted the boy captured, not a hole in his own chest. In a lower-level research bay, Otto Octavius stood over a pair of massive, 4-meter mechanical arms. The neural interface at the base of his neck pulsed with a faint, sickly orange light. "I'll remind you once more, Norman," Otto said into his comms. "The inhibitors are a prototype. If I lose control, the liability is yours." He looked across the lab at Drive. Connors, who was standing by a terminal, his face etched with a deep, silent sorrow. "The boy is coming, Kurt," Otto said, his voice echoing in the metallic room. "Don't tell me your conscience is finally waking up. He's a child, Otto. We're luring a child into a trap. If Norman wanted a peaceful dialogue, he would have sent a lawyer, not me." Otto checked the tension on his actuators. "Do you have any tactical advice for the security teams? If they're stupid enough to fight him, they deserve the results," Connors said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But if Norman had just treated him like a human being instead of a resource, we wouldn't be standing in a fortress waiting for a war." Octavius shrugged, his mechanical limbs mimicking the gesture. "Sentimentality is a luxury we don't have." "Maybe," Connors whispered. He thought about the bird he'd seen with Peter, the same black crow that had nearly killed Norman the night before. The omen of death was already in the building. A siren wailed throughout the floor. "He's in the lobby," a technician screamed. "Spider-Man is through the first gate." "Wait, hold on." The three figures came to a sudden halt against the honeycomb exterior of the Oscorp building. Toombs looked down at the vigilante dangling beneath him, his tone sharp with irritation. "What now? I brought you here. What more do you want?" Peter had his hands full, literally. He was clinging to two separate strands of webbing. One was anchored to the vulture's flight suit, acting as a makeshift seatbelt for the ride. The other gripped a heavy, white mass, Dragoon, bundled into a high-tensile web sphere that looked like an oversized bowling ball. Peter lifted the ball slightly to show Toombs. "You can't exactly crash through the glass with this," Peter noted. "What do you suggest then?" "Walking through the front lobby." Toombs snapped. "If we weren't wearing masks and spandex, that would actually be a great idea," Peter replied. He glanced down at his cargo. Dragoon was a mess of tears and snot, thoroughly broken by the combination of high-speed flight and the indignity of being a webbed projectile. "I'm guessing you didn't leave through the main lobby, did you?" Peter thought, giving the line a sharp tug that made the ball bob in the air. Oz perked up on his shoulder. "Let me have a go." The crow croaked. "I used to be a pro with a yo-yo in my past life." "Not a chance," Peter muttered. "Stingy," Oz grumbled. Dragoon couldn't hear the internal bickering, but he saw the red-eyed crow staring at him from Peter's shoulder. The bird looked entirely too interested in his trajectory. "Osborn will kill me," Dragoon begged, his voice muffled by the webbing. "There's an entrance at the helipad. At the top of the tower. There's a hatch." Peter looked up at Toombs and shrugged. The old man rolled his eyes and opened the throttles. They reached the roof seconds later. The entrance was already open, a dark, square void that looked entirely too much like an invitation. It was silent, save for a few dim red lights flickering below. Peter set the Dragoon ball safely away from the edge so the man wouldn't accidentally roll into the abyss. Toombs landed beside him, peering into the shadows. "You think you're being bugged?" he asked. "I made this suit myself, Toombs." "Not a single wire in it," Peter said, checking his wrist shooters. Toombs scratched his bald head, looking confused. He didn't like the look of the open door. It felt like a trap designed specifically for them. Behind him, he heard a scratching sound. Oz was using his beak to drag the Dragoon ball toward the edge, clearly intent on a hole-in-one. Toombs, a lover of birds, tried a soft, domesticating whistle. Chirp chirp. Oz stopped. He slowly turned his head to look at the old man, his eyes narrowing. He ruffled his feathers and began a slow, deliberate waddle toward Toombs, mimicking a man rolling up his sleeves. "He's so intelligent," Toombs whispered, genuinely delighted. "Truly a magnificent creature." Peter saw the look in Oz's eyes. "Oz, relax. Don't take it personally. By Morgan Freeman's beard, if I don't give this old man a reality check, I'm not a crow," Oz hissed through the link. "Come here, little guy. I've got the best feed in the city waiting for you." Toombs laughed, reaching out. "Go easy on him," Peter whispered. Oz didn't. He lunged forward and delivered a sharp, feathered slap to Toombs' face. The surprise was enough to knock the old man off balance. He stumbled back and disappeared into the hatch. Peter sighed. He looked at Dragoon. "The webbing will dissolve in about an hour. Find the stairs." Then, he dove into the dark after them. Peter fired web lines to slow his fall, landing softly on a metallic platform deep within the building. The area was cavernous and pitch black. Toombs was already there, nursing a bruised face and looking more dazed than angry. "What is wrong with that bird?" Toombs demanded. Oz appeared out of thin air, delivered 2 more slaps to the old man's face, and vanished. "A miracle," Toombs whispered, his face flushing with excitement. "A sign from God. The guy is definitely a few sandwiches short of a picnic," Peter thought. A booming voice cut through the dark. "Welcome to Oscorp, gentlemen." Peter and Toombs moved back to back, scanning the darkness. The sound was coming from every direction at once. "Spider-Man, thank you for coming," the voice continued. It was raspy and thin, like a saw-through bone. "I've prepared a gift to show my appreciation." "I appreciate the thought, but I already had a pretty warm welcome on the way in," Peter called back, his spider sense starting to hum. The voice laughed, a dry, grating sound. "Oh, you must accept it. It's only fair. And Toombs, you little vulture." "Osborn," Toombs roared. "Be patient, Adrian. There's plenty for everyone." The speakers cut out with a click. A set of 6 heavy steel doors at the edge of the platform began to glow with red warning lights before sliding open. Peter's eyes widened. "You have to be kidding me." 3 massive lizard men lumbered into the light. Right behind them, 3 men emerged in harnesses attached to 4 mechanical, serpentine tentacles. The arms acted as their legs, moving with a clicking, insect-like grace. "I hope you find the selection to your liking, Spider-Man." A spotlight hit a glass-walled lab at the far end of the chamber. Norman Osborn sat inside, his oxygen mask in place, watching the arena like a Roman emperor. "It's a trap," Toombs noted, his wings unfolding. "No kidding," Peter replied. "Why exactly did you come down here again?" "The bird pushed me." Peter took a breath, trying to stay focused. "Okay, I'll handle the lizards. You take the guys with the arms." Before he could finish, Toombs' engines roared. The vulture took flight, banking hard toward the ceiling and the hatch they had just come from. "Wait, what about the Octo guys?" Peter shouted. "Good luck, kid," Toombs yelled, disappearing into the shadows above. Peter looked at the 6 monstrosities. Closing in, he felt a wave of sheer exhaustion hit him. Great, just great. The vulture was just as fast at retreating as he had been at arriving. A few seconds after he vanished into the shadows above, a sharp cry of pain echoed through the chamber. Toombs came crashing back down, his green flight suit hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He sat there for a moment, rubbing a swelling bruise on his bald head. The vibrant feathers on his mechanical wings looked limp and ruffled. "Damn it," he grunted. "They've sealed the exits. There's a reinforced barrier blocking the hatch." Peter stared at him. It was obvious Toombs felt a little sheepish about trying to ditch him, but he recovered his pride quickly. He stood up, his gaze turning sharp. The feathers on his wings stiffened, shifting from soft plumage into serrated, metallic blades. Before Peter could even open his mouth to suggest a strategy, the old man spoke up. "What was that plan of yours again?" Peter sighed. He had thought he was the one with the thick skin, but this guy made Oz look humble. He looked at the enemies closing in on them. "I'll handle the lizards," Peter said. "You take the Octo creeps." "Fine by me." The 2 of them lunged in opposite directions. It was clear Norman Osborn had designed this arena specifically for Spider-Man. The walls were smooth, and the ceiling was too high to reach easily. There were no rafters, no pipes, no anchor points. Peter was forced to fight on the ground, relying on his fists and feet. His webbing was relegated to a secondary tool for quick distractions. 2 lizard tails lashed out like iron whips, whistling through the air. Peter leapt back, barely clearing the strike, only to find the 3rd lizard charging him head-on. Seriously, you guys have incredible teamwork, Peter grunted, sidestepping the charge. You ever thought about a career in pro wrestling? He caught the charging lizard's arm as it passed. He planted his feet and heaved, lifting the massive creature off the ground. He swung the monster like a heavy sledgehammer, using its weight to clear some space. But these weren't the mindless beasts from the hospital. These lizards were different. They were faster, more disciplined, and they moved with a calculated ferocity. Fighting them felt like facing 3 weakened versions of Dr. Rotha. Peter raised his arms just in time to block a tail strike from the lizard he'd just thrown. The impact sent him skidding back several feet. These are Drive Connor's designs, Peter realized. He fired 2 web lines, crisscrossing them. One hit a lizard on the left, the other hit the one on the right. He yanked his arms inward, slamming their heads together with a sickening thud. He felt a pang of betrayal. He knew Connors was being forced to help, but seeing how effective these creatures were made it clear the doctor had put his best work into them. You don't have an antidote this time, kid, Oz's voice whispered from his shoulder. That means you have to beat them the old-fashioned way. I know, Peter replied, his eyes fixed on the monsters as they scrambled back to their feet. Need a hand? Oz asked. No. The stubbornness of a teenager flared in his chest. Peter wound up and delivered a crushing uppercut to the lead lizard's jaw. Several jagged teeth flew across the room. Impressive, Parker. You sure you don't want a little help? Oz sounded genuinely surprised. He hadn't planned on intervening, mainly because he knew Osborn wanted Peter alive. Peter wasn't in mortal danger, but he was certainly going to walk away with a lot of bruises. Oz was a jerk, but he didn't actually want to see the kid get pulverized. I said no, Peter shouted. He fired a mass of webbing, pinning the stunned lizard to the floor. 1 down, 2 to go. I need to prove something to Dr. Connors, Peter said. And what's that? Oz asked. Why I do this? Why I'm Spider-Man. Peter's voice was cold and focused. He knew he had to go all out. He couldn't afford to be angry, he needed to be precise. He'd thought about this all night. Connors told him to quit because Norman was dangerous. Gwen told him to stop because she loved him. They both wanted him safe. But they don't get it, Peter growled. He caught a lizard's arm and twisted it with a violent, focused strength. Crack. The sound of snapping bone echoed through the silent chamber. The lizard hissed and recoiled, clutching its mangled limb. Peter didn't flinch. They don't understand why I put on the mask. Oz watched in silence. He wasn't surprised by Peter's resolve. If you can't handle it, just call out, he said. I'm here. I will. Peter nodded, but before he could move for the next strike, a frantic voice cut through the air. Spider. Spidey. Kid. Trade with me. Let's trade. It was Toombs. Peter looked over and saw the vulture struggling. The mechanical tentacles were proving to be too much for the old man. The arms moved like snakes, striking from every angle, and Toombs was doing nothing but frantic, desperate evasive maneuvers. He looked like a mouse in a room full of cats. What are you doing? Peter asked, bewildered. You've got a flight suit. I can't get an opening. I'll take the lizards. You take these metal-armed freaks. Peter didn't have time to argue. He jumped across the room, firing a web line to pull one of the mechanical arms away from Toombs' back. The vulture didn't waste a second. He banked hard, heading straight for Peter's corner of the arena. Damn octopuses, Toombs grumbled as he flew past. If I can't beat them, I can sure as hell handle a couple of crippled reptiles. Toombs dove like a hawk, his wing blades extended. He aimed for the 2 remaining lizards, but as he passed the one Peter had supposedly knocked out, the creature's eyes snapped open. A thick tail whipped out, coiling around Toombs' ankles mid-flight. Wait, what? Toombs' momentum was cut short. He slammed into the floor and began to roll, tumbling across the concrete like a discarded toy. Seriously, Peter stared at the old man. Are you kidding me right now? The situation had flipped in an instant. Peter was now standing in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 lizards and 3 men with mechanical tentacles. Maybe we could just talk about this, guys. Peter raised his hands slowly. He shot a look at Toombs, who was groaning on the floor. What are you even doing here, man? The enemies didn't attack immediately. They formed a circle around him, closing off any escape. Then, Norman's voice crackled through the speakers. So, Spider-Man, how do you like your gift? I hope wait, who is pulling my tube again? Get away from there, Peter sighed. Thanks, Oz. Norman Osborn had become dangerously sensitive about his breathing tube. There was no grand psychological reason for it, he had simply been unplugged before. To be more specific, he had been unplugged by a bird. Even though his physical condition was deteriorating, he knew exactly how the plastic felt against his nostrils. He knew the difference between a secure fit and a loose one. Who's there? Norman croaked. He looked to his left, seeing only the technicians in their white lab coats. He looked to his right, finding his bodyguards standing at attention in their sharp suits and sunglasses. He stared for a long time, but he couldn't find anyone close enough to have touched him. The staff kept their distance, hovering at the edges of the room to avoid the inevitable splash zone of his temper. Norman adjusted the tube, pushing it back into place. He told himself he was being paranoid, but a cold, nagging sensation crawled up his spine. He forced his attention back to the center of the arena. A red and blue blur was dancing through the shadows. Spider-Man, the name was fitting. He moved with a terrifying fluidity, dodging the metallic tentacles as if he knew exactly where they would strike before the pilots even moved. One moment, the hero was flat against the floor, using his webbing to slingshot himself away from a crushing blow. The next, he was midair, his legs snapping out like a martial arts star to kick a claw aside. It was perfect. Norman wanted to cheer, not for the hero's skill, but for the hope of his own survival. This was the miracle he needed. But the breathing tube felt loose again. If he moved too much, he'd have to fix it a 3rd time. It was infuriating. Spider-Man, Norman called out, his voice echoing through the chamber. I think it's time you learned the truth. Despite being surrounded by monsters and machines, the boy couldn't help himself. Can we do this later? I'm a little busy. Norman managed a thin smile. He adjusted the tube as his facial muscles twitched. You were more optimistic than I expected. Years ago, Oscorp began researching spider genetics. We intended to transfer the modified traits into a human host. I didn't realize Oscorp was a petting zoo, Spider-Man quipped, backflipping over a lizard's tail. First lizards, then spiders, now octopuses. You interested in some high-tech calamari? My treat. Norman ignored the joke, his expression distant and arrogant. The experiment was a failure. The lead researcher destroyed the data and fled for his own selfish reasons. I thought the serum was lost to history. Until you appeared. Norman leaned forward in his chair. Your existence is tied to this building, Spider-Man. You were an Oscorp legacy. Then you owe me some backdated royalties, the hero shot back. Norman's composure finally cracked. He stared at the masked figure, genuinely baffled by the sheer absurdity of the boy's personality. How could someone be this ridiculous in the face of death? Is being a hero just an excuse to release your inner comedian? Norman took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Wait, he finally realized what was wrong. The air wasn't coming. Norman spun his wheelchair around. Who touched my tank? The sight that met him was a nightmare. His bodyguards and technicians were slumped on the floor, unconscious. Not a single sound had been made. The room had gone completely silent. Panic flared in Norman's chest. He forgot about the fight in the arena. He tried to steer his chair toward the exit, but a sharp, familiar cry stopped him cold. Caw! The crow was sitting on a nearby console, blocking his path. Norman froze. He couldn't forget that bird, or the way it had looked at him before plunging his world into darkness. Oz was back, and he hadn't just pulled the tube this time, he had taken the entire oxygen tank with him. What are you? Norman hissed, his face contorting with fear. To him, this wasn't a bird. It was a herald. Death had come to collect. Oz's abyssal eyes fixed on him for a heartbeat before the bird took flight. Norman raised his arms to protect his face. He felt a sharp tug. When he opened his eyes, he saw his breathing tube and the primary valve from his tank flying across the room. The billionaire sat in his chair, a chaotic mix of fury and terror drowning out his reason. A piercing scream from the arena pulled his attention back to the fight. One of the octopilots was clutching his head, howling in agony. Spider-Man stood over him, holding a severed mechanical tentacle in his hands. The loss of the limb seemed to trigger a massive neural feedback loop. The pilot collapsed, his remaining 3 arms twitching frantically like a dying insect. Norman knew why. The interface was a prototype. It wasn't meant to handle a traumatic disconnection. Peter stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving. His suit was shredded in several places, revealing bruised, bleeding skin. His mask was torn, exposing one eye and a shock of dark hair, but the fire in his gaze hadn't faded. He looked like he had an endless supply of strength. With a combination of webbing and raw power, Peter began to dismantle the remaining threats. The lizard men, perhaps weakened by the serum or intimidated by the boy's ferocity, fell quickly. Peter had learned enough from his fight with Rotha to handle them with ease. They were brutal, but they lacked the raw, focused hatred of the Doctor. One by one, the monsters were pinned to the walls or the floor. Finally, only the 2 remaining octopilots were left. Peter moved with a focused, silent efficiency, targeting the connections of their mechanical limbs. It didn't take long. Norman watched as the boy walked toward his glass-walled sanctuary. He was gasping for air, his lungs burning for the oxygen that was now scattered across the floor. He wanted to call for help, to order more guards into the room, but the Crow was still there, watching him with a strange curiosity. "Bold move, Parker," Oz's voice whispered in Peter's mind. "Go ahead and finish it. I've made sure he's in a listening mood." Peter stopped in front of the glass. He looked at the man in the chair, the blood dripping from his knuckles and the light in his eyes making him look far older than 17. Norman swallowed hard, looking up at the spider emblem on the boy's chest. "Whatever you want," Norman wheezed. "Name your price. I can give you anything." Peter stared at him through the one good lens of his mask. "Where is Connors?" Peter asked, his voice steady. "Tell him to get the lab ready. We're starting the experiment."